Fantastic. All right. For those who just joined us, welcome to the June 2020 Space Association meeting, virtual meeting, unfortunately, but soon, hopefully, we'll be getting back to meeting together face-to-face as well as virtually. My name is Peter Aylward. I'm the president of the Space Association of Australia. And we've got a really fun night for you tonight, and I'm going to quickly take you through a couple of slides just to tell you what we're doing tonight, and also a bit of housekeeping with the association. So as you can see on the screen there, we're going to do a couple of slides on what we're doing as an association, some of the administrative things and some of the things we've got planned in the future. Then we've got three VIP guests with us, which is fantastic. Dr. Malcolm Davis, he's joining us from Canberra tonight, and I'll give him a proper introduction shortly. And then Dr. Alice Gorman, she'll be joining us. She's joining us from South Australia, and I think we've got Vienna Tran, who's also from South Australia. So it's a real multi-state affair tonight, which is great, and that's part of the advantage of having these meetings virtually, of course. So without further ado, I'm just going to give you a quick update from our members' perspective. For those who are members of the association, we were due to have our annual general meeting before the end of May by the sort of statutory requirements of associations. However, the committee because we've all been meeting virtually, we've not been able to do that. So we've got a 3-month extension from the Consumer Affairs Victoria due to COVID, of course. Everything's due to COVID, and we're hoping to have our meeting before the end of August. So we're going to hold it on a different night to our normal regular meetings. We used to do it on the same night as the actual meeting, and to be honest, it was never really a great combination. So we're going to actually hold the AGM separately. So we'll give you details of that when they're worked out and the actual date. We're going to have an ability also to have voting as needed during that meeting. So once again, stand by, watch your social media and emails, etc. So just a couple of things we've done recently. We had a special Zoom party. In fact, we had 2 Zoom parties in a row, and the second one was actually successful because the SpaceX Demo 2 mission got off the ground. So that was great fun. We had a very early morning on the Sunday, the 31st of May, and I think we had up and down around 20, 25 participants in that, and it was lots of fun. And we had a bit of chat while we're having our holds, etc., waiting for the weather. So also this year marked the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13, which took place in April back in 1970, and the association had had planned a special event, actually a live event at a theatre here in Melbourne. When COVID all hit, we took that to a virtual meeting, and we had speakers from the Honeysuckle Creek and Parkes Radio Telescope and Tidbinbilla tracking station joining us through Skype, through Zoom, and giving a presentation on their recollections and experiences back then. It was a great evening. And Mike Dinn, who was the deputy director of Honeysuckle Creek and later became the director of Tidbinbilla, became very good friends with Joe Kerwin. And I'll get to that in a moment. But we also had, I reached out to Fred Hayes, who I've met once before and had a couple of interactions with him. And he sent us a beautiful pre-recorded greeting, which was nice. And I also interviewed him for about 45 minutes. And that's available on our YouTube channel. If anyone wants to go there, you can go there via our website. But also, as I mentioned, Joe Kerwin, he was the Capcom, one of the predominant Capcons during Apollo 13, and also later flew on Skylab. He joined us at the meeting, on the Zoom meeting, and actually contributed quite a lot. We had a great chat. So that was a real highlight for everybody, having Joe Kerwin there. It was very early in the morning for him, but he was totally enthusiastic about being involved. So that was wonderful. And as I mentioned, we have the entire 3.5 hours of the event on our YouTube channel. So just go to space.asn.au and go to the link to YouTube and you'll see it there. As part of the celebrations, we created these commemorative Apollo 13 mugs, which had the quotes from Mission Control and also who's the other crew member? Jack Swigert, when he responded to Mission Control, and also a graphic of the before and after service module. And as a thank you gift, we sent one of those mugs to each of the presenters, including Fred Hayes. And we got this message back from his granddaughter, and sent a picture of Fred holding our mug, our Space Association mug. So that was particularly delightful. Fred's a wonderful guy and very generous with his time, and very, very nice to work with, and a true gentleman. And he's also heavily involved in the Infinity Science Centre in Louisiana. And in fact, he's been instrumental in its establishment, and is the sort of their what's the word? Their sort of sponsor, or their, the main sort of person that recommends things to them. It's also got his Apollo 19 first stage Saturn V rocket. That was a stage that was being built for Apollo 19, which he's very likely to be the commander of. Obviously, Apollo 19 got cancelled, and so the first stage and the rest of the rocket is still on the Earth. And so it must be bittersweet for Fred to see that when he goes into the Science Centre. But he went up to the Science Centre and with his special Apollo 13 space mask, and signed a whole bunch of photographs as a fundraiser for the centre. So typical of Fred, a real gentleman. And he drove, as he says, 780 miles return to do that. So it's wonderful. Really, really nice. All right, so that's about it for me. For those who are not familiar, we do have a monthly meeting on the fourth Monday of each month, except in December, because the fourth Monday gets a bit crazy. We usually have that about a week or 2 weeks earlier. So at this stage, our next meeting is July 27, and we're hoping that it's at the Golden Gate Hotel in South Melbourne, but that really depends on the restrictions being lifted. It was going to be lifted here in Victoria to 50 people at a venue, and it with some problems we've had, it stayed at the 20. So hopefully that will be lifted in the next couple of weeks, and we'll be able to schedule that to the Golden Gate, but once again having it as a virtual meeting as well. The other dates, as you can see on the screen, August 24, September 28, October 26, and November 23. And as I say, December 14 looks like will be our end of year event. Now, a bit of sad news. Members, a long-time member, or both members of our association, Peter and Lynn Bush. Peter unfortunately passed away just a few days ago on the 18th of June. Seemed to be quite a sudden thing. I've got no details about what the situation was, but Peter and Lynn were real beautiful couple, and worked well together. They ran this Off This Planet roadshow business of theirs, and they'd travel around Australia presenting to schools and community groups and anybody else that would have them on these prep to year 10 sort of presentations, night sky science, moon phases, etc., etc. And they had a planetarium that they travelled with, an inflatable planetarium that they put up, and had star displays and things. And you can see some pictures there at the bottom of their van that they travelled around with. And we were on holiday in Tasmania one time, and next thing you know, I saw Peter and Lynn driving the opposite direction, going down to do an event down there. So they were all over the place. You get emails from them. They'd be in Northern Territory and Queensland and Tassie and whatever. So yeah, that was wonderful. And I've actually the first time I met them in America, in Houston, Texas, at the Space Center there. So very sad. So unfortunately, we do bid farewell to Peter, and we're sending a sympathy card to Lynn on behalf of the members and committee of the Space Association of Australia. And I just thought I'd just put this picture up here. This is a very classic Peter Bush picture showing him with the thing that he loved to do, enthusiastic, always positive. And it's a real tragic loss, actually. And our sympathies go out to Lynn and the rest of his family and friends. All right. So as I've briefly mentioned, this is the Space Association presenting tonight, and we're a non-profit group. We just run on memberships, and if you're interested to become a member or join again or just maintain your membership, we'd love to have you. That's the only way we can fund all of our activities. We also do a weekly radio show and special events. So we really are driven by a membership. So we appreciate everybody. And if you think about joining up, we'd love to have you. And as I've mentioned, the meetings, hopefully they will resume next month. And the meeting venue we use is the Golden Gate Hotel down in South Melbourne. So, and as I said, hopefully the next meeting will be on the July 27th. So watch this space. We'll send all the emails out and information out and on our social media. Well, that's enough for me. You come here listen to me, so I'll get on with this. So I would, with great honour, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Dr. Malcolm Davis. He's the Australian Strategic Policy Institute Senior Analyst in the Defence and Strategy Capability area. Malcolm completed a Master of Arts in Strategic Studies at ANU back in 1997. He went on to do a PhD in Strategic Studies at the University of Hull in the UK in 2002. He then secured a position as a lecturer in Defence Studies at King's College in London, at the UK Joint Services Command and Staff College in Shrivenham. And he spent 5 years with the Department of Defence, initially in Navy Headquarters and then Strategic Policy Division. And from March 2012 to January 2016, he was postdoctoral research fellow at Bond University. And then he started at the Australian Space Policy Institute, Strategic Policy Institute, I should say, as a senior analyst in defence strategy and capability in January of 2016. So he's also presented multiple papers, and the one we're going to be looking at specifically tonight is his reflections on and observations of the progress since his Australia's Future in Space paper of February 2018. So with that, Malcolm, I am going to yield the floor to you. I'll stop my sharing and allow you to bring your screen up, and we'll hand over to Malcolm.
Unmute. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, coming through. I'll mute my mic now, but I can hear you, no problem.
Good. Well, thank you for having me all tonight. This is the first time I've been in one of your events, because normally you're down in Melbourne and I'm here in Canberra, so it's a bit difficult for me to get to you guys. But I appreciate the potential now with remote meetings and webinars and so forth to be able to engage a lot more wider, more easily, which is, I suppose, one benefit of the current COVID-19 pandemic. I want to talk about where Australia is going in space. I've been with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra since January 2016. For those of you who don't know anything about ASPI, it's Australia's leading think tank on defence and strategic studies and national security. We're independent of government, although we get some of our funding from government. Our charter says that we're independent, so we're not necessarily sharing the government line on everything. We do a variety of activities, including the ASPI Strategist blog, which is our leading publication, but we also do major reports, of which the strategy papers are probably the most important. Plus, we do conferences and workshops, and we engage through the media to shape Australia's debate on defence, strategy and national security. I'm one of two people at ASPI that do space policy, and it's been my focus since I joined ASPI, and it's very nice to be able to focus on space policy and sort of because so much is happening in the field. So let me get on with my presentation and work through this, and then we can have a good Q&A. Yeah. So two major reports I've done since joining ASPI, the most recent being the Australian Defence Force Contested Space, which I did at the request of the Department of Defence. The objective of that report was to identify the key challenges facing Australia from adversaries developing counter space capabilities, and how Australia could maintain freedom of access and freedom of action in space. And the earlier report, which came out in 2018, Australia's Future in Space, which was a broader analysis of where we're going as a country in space. And tonight, I think we'll be focusing more on that earlier report, but I'm happy to talk to the issues that came out in the later report as well. In the process of developing a third report, Space and Warfighting, which really looks at how the big strategic debate is occurring across the world about how we respond to counter space challenges, space weaponization, and where Australia sits and all of that. I've done numerous articles within the ASPI Strategist, our blog, on space policy and space security, as well as doing publications in print media and appearances on TV. So I guess you could call me ASPI's main space geek, which it's a tag I wear as a badge of honor, because I'm incredibly lucky to be able to be there. It's a good time to be a space policy analyst in Australia, and let me explain. When I first started at ASPI in 2016, we were just, as a country, we were just starting to get our head into the importance of space as a domain and where Australia could go, and the potential that the commercial space sector had to offer. I was going up to speak to people at Defence at the time to start preparing my initial research for that first report, and the attitude very much was, well, look, we rely on the Americans for so much in terms of the hardware, the satellites, the launch capabilities. We provide a suitable piece of real estate, to borrow that immortal phrase from the late Des Ball, to provide ground facilities and the people to man them. And we manage the data that's flying between the space segment and hang on, I just lost my screen sharing for some reason. What's going on there? There we go. We manage that data flow, and that was really the mindset at the time back in 2016 in terms of space in Australia. But things started to change at that point. I think leading up to that International Astronautical Congress in Adelaide in 2017, there was that review of space industry in Australia and space policy, the regulatory environment, and I think that the growing consensus was that Australia could be a credible actor in space, in the global commercial space sector, and it could be profitable to this country and beneficial to this country in so many ways. And I think that recognition by government at the time was really important in terms of laying the basis for government agreeing to establish a space agency. And I think since then, there's been a fundamental change in mindset in this country that is really good to see. And my point there about the past is not going to come back. That apathy and indifference of past government policy towards space is gone. It's not going to come back. You now have the Australian Space Agency, which has taken the lead. Last year it released its Civil Space Strategy. We're recognising that the global space industry is currently worth about $350 billion, but it's going to grow to about $1.1 trillion US by about 2040. And we want to be part of that. So the Australian space sector is expected to grow probably about 7.1% through the next few years. It may grow a bit faster depending on the impact of COVID, of course. Industry value over the decade to 23-24 is expected to grow at about 8.6% annualized compared to a GDP of around about 2.7%. And that GDP has obviously gone down as a result of COVID. So the goal is to grow that market from about 10,000 jobs and 3.9 billion to 20,000 jobs and 12.1 billion by 2030. And the key thing that's making the difference here is that space is now more affordable. The transformation that Space 2.0 and the commercial sector has made has been profound. Obviously, state-run, government-run space programs like NASA and the European Space Agency and JAXA all have an important role to play, but really the most innovative work is being done in the commercial sector. Admittedly, a lot of it with government subsidies. You look at SpaceX, that's exactly what's happening, but the innovation is occurring there. And I think for Australia, with the space agency, it's not meant to be a mini NASA down under, it's meant to be an organisation to stimulate and grow that commercial space sector and utilise Space 2.0 technologies, that commercial capability to reduce the cost of getting into space and using space, and expand the ability of space to be used to a broader range of actors, to the point now where you have high school students and universities building satellites. I think that's really significant. That never used to happen. And I think these trends will continue as the technologies mature. My focus going into this field back in 2016 and taking it forward is I look at space policy issues and how space policy is evolving. Obviously that involves thinking about the technology and the capability as well, but really I'm focusing on how we bring capabilities together to enable policy goals. And so I'm very much focused on future capability development for Australia. Where are we headed as a country? One of the trends that I encountered when I first started was a mindset that I think is gone now, but the mindset set was we do the ground segment, we rely on others to do the space segment. That's gone. I think that now what you're seeing is a recognition that we can do the space segment, we can do space launch, we can build satellites and launch them, and we can do it in a cost-effective manner. And so I'm very interested in pursuing where that's headed in terms of future capability development for Australia. What sort of space capabilities should we be aiming for? And I'm a big fan of developing launch capability for this country. Secondly, because ASPI is a defence and strategy focused organisation, obviously I'm focused on space security and in particular the evolving counter-space threat. The sorts of space weapons capabilities and anti-satellite capabilities that we're starting to see in our key adversaries like China and Russia, and how that's going to challenge the ability of the US and its allies to maintain space access and to maintain freedom of access in space. And that was obviously the focus of my second strategy paper that came out last year. But that's also forced me now to increasingly grapple with the challenging area of space law, governance and regulation, because I've recognized that on space, dealing with space weapons and counter space capabilities and talking about space deterrence and resilience is one thing, but increasingly the other side of that coin, and just as important, is space law and space regulation, and as a means to mitigate the risk and moderate the rush towards space weaponization. That opens up the possibility of space collaboration within the Five Eyes. We have the Combined Space Initiative, the CSPO arrangements, which are very important. Those have been extended beyond the Five Eyes to, most recently, to France and Germany. One of the themes that I've been pushing is that maybe we need to extend it further to include Japan. But the potential for space collaboration within Five Eyes and beyond to boost space security and to minimize the risks from counter space developments, I think, is an area that I'm particularly interested in. So what do I believe is where we're going, I suppose, is the key thing that we're talking about tonight. What's our future as a new space actor? I call us a new space actor because, yes, we had the days of ELDO. In fact, my uncle was an engineer at Woomera as part of ELDO. He went on to the US to be part of NASA as a launch engineer at Cape Canaveral. But those days of Woomera and ELDO disappeared because the government really didn't follow through on the possibility for Australia sustaining its own Indigenous space program. So we're a new space actor with an old history. So where are we going? I think that I'm pushing the case for space sovereignty in everything, both in terms of the space segment, our ability to develop space hardware such as satellites, and the ground segment to be able to develop the ground facilities to be able to utilize those satellites, as well as responsive sovereign space access. And I suppose my vision for Australia in space is pursuing a future where Australian-built satellites are launched on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites on a regular basis. I don't believe that this country should have a purely ground-based space program or that we should be purely dependent on others to launch our satellites. We should be able to build our own satellites, build our own launch vehicles, and launch those vehicles from Australia on a regular basis. And that's the fundamental vision that underpins everything I write. Secondly, I think that Australia should aim towards becoming a full and comprehensive space actor in every sense of the word. And that would include participation in crewed missions, human spaceflight. Not necessarily immediately from Australia, but certainly we should be able to have Australian astronauts as Australian citizens flying on SpaceX missions or NASA missions as part of Artemis and up to the International Space Station. We should also be focusing very much on boosting the commercial space sector and participating in that commercial space sector, utilizing the advantages of Space 2.0 as a path towards what I call Space 3.0, which is a space-based economy, and where that takes us in the bigger perspective of humanity as a spacefaring species, a multi-planet species. I think that's really important. Thirdly, we obviously need to be a key defense space power alongside the US and our other Five Eyes partners and other key defense allies. So we need to think seriously and deeply about how we as a country use space and the space domain for defense and national security purposes, and how can we burden share in orbit with our key allies. I think that's vital. And defense needs to move decisively in this regard to develop sovereign space capabilities, including responsive sovereign space launch. So this goes back to the point I was making, is that we should dramatically reduce, though not end, but dramatically reduce our dependency on others to provide access and use of space. So looking forward through to the 2030s or 2029, how best to do this? We need to go as much as possible down the commercial sector route, emphasize small, fast, reusable and cheap as a motto for our space program, rather than large, complex hardware. We need to recognize and fully exploit innovation in space. And that means we have to be willing to embrace risk and learn to fail early, but learn from those fails so that we can improve our capabilities. We've all seen SpaceX testing prototypes for its Starship vehicle, and those prototypes exploding. That's not a source of failure, that's a source of success, because SpaceX is learning from those explosions each time and improving the design so that eventually one day, and I'm hoping in the next 2 or 3 years, that you will see Starship and Super Heavy flying. And that's going to be really critical. But to get to that point where we're willing to embrace risk and learn from failure, we have to deregulate. We have to go down the path of recognizing, yes, space is hard, and yes, you will have failures. And so we have to make it possible to fail. Because if you make it possible to fail, you'll improve and you'll do things better. We have to identify and understand trends in both the ground and space segment early and exploit a second mover advantage quickly. Well, that means we need to look ahead. Rather than being conservative in our thinking, we need to be prepared to think radically about how we move forward. You've got companies in Queensland, Gilmore Space Technology, Black Sky Aerospace that are doing amazing things with space launch. And I think they're market leaders. You've also got companies, for example, like Hypersonics in Brisbane that are developing hypersonic flight technologies. The potential for companies like that to be able to take new approaches to getting hardware into space quickly, I think, is something that we should be encouraging. So we need to identify where the disruptive technology innovation is going to occur and invest in those technologies. And everything, I think, points towards recognizing and embracing the value and the need for sovereign space launch. The days of suggesting that Australia doesn't do space launch are over. We need to be ready to be able to launch Australian satellites on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites. And I think we're in the right trajectory to do that. But it's vital that we go down the path of ensuring commercial sector involvement all the way and let that private sector drive innovation and lead rather than restraining them with government regulation. You can't have that dead hand of government regulation, otherwise we won't progress as fast as we should. I think the Space Agency has done amazing work in its short history, and it's going to go on to do incredible achievements. It's exactly the right model for Australia. You don't have a mini NASA down under. You have an agency that I think is doing exactly the right thing in terms of identifying civil space priority areas, moonshot goals designed to stimulate and grow the commercial sector and create opportunities there, as well as open up the potential for Australia to engage with international partners. And I think that's vital, particularly when those international partners are our allies. As a defence analyst, I do need to say that international engagement needs to be consistent with our national security and our national values. And so therefore we need to be very cautious about talking to China, and we need to be very cautious about talking to Russia, because those two countries, particularly China, I think, it's made in China 2025, and its civil military fusion approach really is designed to take other countries' technologies and use it to boost their own capabilities. We can't do that. So I think we need to engage with our allies, and we need to have a very cautious approach to engaging with China and Russia. And I'm a defence analyst, so I'm going to be plain spoken in this regard. We also need to ensure that space progress aligns with defence needs. The DSTO Starshot that was focused on resilient multi-mission space was really important, because there you have DSTO really promoting the importance of Australia developing its own smart satellite constellations. And this is something where the Australian commercial space sector can really play a critical role. So we are heading in the right trajectory for success in the future, I believe, providing government sustains its support. And I think it will, because there is broad popular consensus for Australia in space. Anthony Murphy, the Deputy Director of the Space Agency, said it consistently, and I always quote him: there are two cool things in life, dinosaurs and space. You know, I think that space is a cool thing for the next generation to get excited about. So where do we go in the future? At the national level, I think, as I said, the Australian Space Agency is doing exactly the right thing. It's provided a clear and coherent strategy for Australia's future in space. Deregulation is critical, particularly that deregulation in a manner that opens up opportunities for commercial space companies, including space launch from Australia. And I think we're heading in the right direction in that regard. We're seeing a vibrant, forward-looking, ambitious, and unafraid commercial space sector, which is exciting to be part of. Every time I go to Adelaide for a South Australian Space Forum, there's a buzz that you don't get necessarily in other places. And so I think we need to sustain that buzz. We need to sustain the excitement that Australia's commercial space sector is enjoying, because they will lead, they will take the country forward into space. And I think what they need to do is get runs on the board in terms of visible achievements. And I think we're already starting to see that, where you're starting to see satellites being launched. Having an Australian space launch from Australia, whether it's from Nhulunbuy up in the Northern Territory or Whalers Way in South Australia, I think it's the next big step for us, and we need to achieve that relatively quickly. I think defence has become far more space aware and space savvy than what it was. They recognise that space is a really critical domain. They recognise the risks of over-dependency. So they're no longer relaxed about this. They recognise that they can't simply just assume that the Americans will provide space to us. And they also feel and understand that we can actually burden share an orbit by doing more in space. And that's really positive to see. Our university sector is engaging in fantastic space science related research and development. We're leading the world in so many different areas in terms of astronomy, astrophysics, space science, and space related medical research. So we need to sustain all of that. But above all else, we need to work on governance, regulatory reform, and space law. And I think Australia is playing a really visible role in this area. The Woomera Manual being developed by the University of Adelaide, I think, is a fantastic effort to try and deal head on with one of the most important issues that we're going to face in the future, which is how do we change our approach to space law and space regulation and governance, where we're going into a future where space is far more contested and far more competitive. That brings me nicely into the defence and national security space, so let me focus on that. We used to have this mindset, I think, that space was this sort of peaceful commons, this sanctuary from conflict that sat serene above terrestrial geopolitics below. But it's not. It certainly is no longer the case. It's a contested, operationally limited environment. It's very much now a centre of gravity for modern warfare. The Australian Defence Force, the US military, other Western militaries, the Chinese, the Russians, all rely on space to be able to fight joint and integrated military operations. And so space is becoming a centre of gravity where an adversary that can deny us access to space gains a significant operational advantage. And so we have to recognise that space in future conflict may become operationally limited. And we're moving from militarization, which has been a fact since the early 1960s, to weaponization, where you're starting to see major power actors develop space weapons capabilities and anti-satellite capabilities, whether they're kinetic kill ASATs or soft kill co-orbital systems or ground-based cyber warfare against satellites. These are happening. And so we need to respond to those. Space is congested. It's becoming more crowded, and it's going to get far more crowded, as I'm sure you're aware, with the implications of companies establishing mega constellations in the coming decade. How do we manage those huge numbers of satellites in space compared to where we've been in the past? And how do we reduce the risk of space debris, creating the Kessler syndrome that we're all seeking to avoid? I think this is really critical. Space traffic management is a future area that Australia needs to be getting on top of. How do we, for example, bring together our research into artificial intelligence with space traffic management? And can we develop smart or intelligent satellites that can avoid collisions rather than having some human on the ground trying to manage thousands of satellites? I think that maybe the solution there is to go down the AI path. And space is competitive. Space 2.0 and New Space has done some fantastic things in terms of transforming the space sector and democratizing space so that more countries, rather than just the major powers, the more countries that are smaller, middle and small powers can utilize space more effectively and have their own space programs. A classic example being New Zealand. What New Zealand is doing, exploiting rocket labs and so forth. But the downside of Space 2.0, of course, is that more countries, more space actors make it more difficult for states to preserve their own space advantages and their space leadership. And so it's becoming challenging for the US to maintain its traditional leadership role in space. I think that you're seeing the US respond to the sort of major power adversary counter-space developments that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years with the Chinese and the Russians. The Space Force is probably one of the very small number of good things that Donald Trump has done. A lot of people criticize the Space Force, and I think they're right to challenge it as undefined in terms of its purpose and its approach and how it's going to achieve its goals and what those goals are. But I do think that the US does need to respond to the sorts of counter-space threats that you're starting to see appear out of China and Russia. And I think the Space Force was inevitable. Whether Trump did it or whether someone else did it, it was going to emerge. And so it's not going to go away. It's going to be evolving post-Trump, and maybe it will get more clear in terms of its purpose and how it's going to achieve its goals, and its strategy will become more apparent, but it's going to be there. So we have to engage with the Space Force at the government-to-government level. I think that's critical to our defence and national security, and we should be talking to them as much as possible. We're seeing the rise of counter-space capabilities emerging with China and Russia in particular. Last year, India tested an anti-satellite weapon. The US hasn't got an operational anti-satellite capability in the traditional sense. They have a counter-communications capability that is designed to jam GPS, but they have yet to deploy a counter-space capability. But China and Russia certainly are moving down that path. China tested an ASAT in 2007 that created a huge amount of space debris. And they have been testing launch vehicles that can supposedly put an ASAT into geo since about 2014, I believe. They've also tested co-orbital rendezvous and proximity operations that will be suitable for soft kill counter space capabilities that are designed to maneuver a satellite up close to a target and then zap it with electronic warfare or a directed energy weapon, or block its access or interfere with it somehow. I think the future is those soft kill systems. Everyone recognizes the risks and the dangers of using hard kill, where you create clouds of space debris. And I don't think anyone really wants to go down that path. Whereas soft kill, the ability to disable or disrupt or damage a satellite but leave it intact, is something that probably is going to be the focus. And cyber threats from the ground, the ability to hack a satellite, is something we all need to think about. But the key point here is that space is a critical center of gravity and an operational environment. It's not just an enabler of terrestrial warfare. It's now about how do we fight in war, fight a war in space for control of space. And the broader debate that's now emerging in the US, and I think that we need to think about, is the blue versus brown water debate, in terms of the brown water being the region between LEO and GEO, and the blue water being the region from GEO out to cislunar space. The brown water obviously is more relevant to the immediate needs of terrestrial military forces. I can't see really a good rationalization for space-based weapons or sensors out at cislunar space somehow changing the military dynamics on the ground on Earth. Where the blue water is coming into its own, I think, is in the more distant future, and say the late 2020s into the 2030s and 40s, where you have a human presence on the moon utilizing lunar resources and competition over those resources. And so on the one hand, you have a debate in the US saying, let's focus on the brown water because that's of immediate relevance to where we are now. On the other hand, you're saying, some people are saying, okay, we need to be thinking forward here, and how do we ensure that we control that vital astrostrategic terrain up around the moon? Certainly, I think the brown water, as I said, is probably the here and now. When you look at what the Chinese are thinking in terms of how they think about the use of space for warfare, at the declaratory level, they say space is all about peaceful use of space in their declared space policy statement. But when you look at the readings coming out of the PLA Academy of Military Science in Beijing, Brian Wheaton and Victoria Sampson in 2019 said that very clearly in their counter space report, China would strive to attack first at the campaign and tactical levels in order to maintain the space battlefield initiative, and that the intent should be to conceal concentration of forces and make a decisive large-scale first strike. That's essentially a space Pearl Harbor. So they're developing the means to be able to do that. Now, whether from China's perspective they're seeking to be able to do that via deterrence, or whether it's actually an aggressive step to deny the US access to space and thus us access to space, I think is a key area of debate. But we can't assume that the Chinese wouldn't do that. Moving on from the military side of things to a degree, obviously there's a lot of focus on going back to the moon. I think, once again, like the Space Force, this is the second really positive thing that the Trump administration has done, that acceptance of the fact that we have to break free of the constraint of low Earth orbit and get back to the moon. Last time we were there was 1972. The goal now is to get back to the surface of the moon by late 2024. I was hopeful that we would achieve that when Artemis was first announced. Now I'm not so hopeful. I think that the combination of COVID, the possibility that Trump will lose in November, the impact of COVID on the US economy will probably push that landing back a bit. And it may be that the original goal of 2028 might be more achievable. But nevertheless, I think that the US, every aspect of US space policy now is focused very much on getting back to the moon, rather than, as I would put it, often wallowing around in low Earth orbit all the time. And so Australia is part of that. We've essentially signed an agreement with NASA and the Australian Space Agency to contribute technology and expertise to support that goal. It's a worthwhile goal, in my opinion. I think it is really critical because what it does is opens up the possibility of space resource utilization for opening up Space 3.0, that space-based economy that is going to be so critical if we want to do anything more than simply a flags and footprints mission on the moon. Interesting question is how Artemis will fare if President Biden gains office. It's uncertain, but I really don't think Biden would cancel Artemis because that would have a huge political impact to his detriment in a critical state like Florida and other various different states. So the smart thinking there is that Biden will support Artemis. He may change the date of the first mission to land on the moon, but Artemis is going ahead. With that, return to the moon, of course, is the debate over the relevance of the moon for future space security. Some people say in the US space power community, particularly within the Space Force, that it's high astrostrategic terrain for future blue water astropolitical competition with China. I am somewhat sympathetic to that perspective, but I recognize that that vision, that future is very much off in probably the late 2020s into the early 2030s, or maybe even later than that. And certainly the US AF Space Command had a deep future vision document called Space 2060, which charted out this blue water astropolitical competition on and around the moon and the use of asteroids. And they basically said the US has to be able to be present on the lunar surface and dominate that cislunar environment, because if we don't, then the Chinese will. And so I think that that bigger vision, that more expansive blue water vision, is a really interesting one. But I do think we need to focus very much on that brown water environment first, and at the same time support at a civilian level that return to the moon. And so you're seeing Australia supporting Artemis, the potential for us to be able to offer technologies in terms of remote operations and robotics, space medicine is obviously very clear. Cislunar logistics is a really important one, because if Australia is going to develop a space launch capability for going to low Earth orbit, to put small satellites in orbit, then really we're talking about a bit more delta V to get a payload to the moon. And that to me is something that we should be thinking about offering. How does our sovereign space launch capability and the companies in Australia deliver payloads to the lunar surface to support operations by humans on the surface? That is something that I think we should be thinking about. Aussie Naughts is my cheeky way of talking about Australian astronauts. A friend of mine on Twitter, Maz Jovanovic, she's a test pilot. We talked about this, and she was very keen to do this, and I think it's an excellent idea. I do not see any reason whatsoever why an Australian citizen cannot stand on the lunar surface in a spacesuit with the Australian flag on that spacesuit. I think that would be one of the most inspiring visions and inspiring sights for the next generation of Australians, the young people of this country, to be able to look at an Australian citizen standing on the lunar surface and to be able to realise, yes, they too can go on to the moon, or they can go to Mars. They do not have to become an American citizen to do that. So I think we should be supporting human spaceflight and developing an Australian astronaut corps. Obviously, those astronauts will be flying probably on commercial spacecraft or US spacecraft, but I do think we should be doing that. Space 3.0. I talked about this earlier. It's the growth of a space-enabled economy. And I think this is really critical because at the moment, Artemis is very much talked of in terms of going to the moon to get to Mars. And the risk there is that we kind of get to the moon, we do a few missions, we maybe have a small human-tended base, and then we go on to Mars and forget about the moon. That would be a fundamental error. I think the growth of a space-enabled economy and the growth of a permanent human presence on and around the moon to sustain future human space exploration is more important than going to Mars. Mars will be there at the end of the day. We will get to Mars. But what we need to do is establish that multi-planet species, that spacefaring civilization, and that means we need to have a space-based economy that stretches from low Earth orbit out to cislunar space. We need to be able to learn how to do space resource utilization and live off the land rather than hauling everything up Earth's gravity well at great expense. And so we need to recognize there's a link between a space-based economy and sustaining space exploration. I think Elon Musk gets this. With Starlink, that mega constellation is really about sustaining his goals for Mars settlement. And so we need to do the same thing in terms of utilizing space-based economy, wherever it's space-based manufacturing using large on-orbit 3D printing, space tourism, the shipping of water from the lunar regolith to low Earth orbit to be able to fuel rockets, space logistics, the ability to be able to do on-orbit refueling and repair of old satellites. All of these things could be done within Space 3.0 and a space-based economy. And Australia can play a role in all of these areas. There's no reason why we can't be a part of that. But that all requires regulatory reform. It requires changes to governance and updating our space law. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty, a really important document. It's a foundation document, but it was written in 1967. And it's a different world out there now. And I think that the 1967 Outer Space Treaty needs to have a series of parallel new documents, legal documents that are updated for the 21st century to address some of the issues and shortcomings in the 1960 Outer Space Treaty, particularly as states begin competing for resources on and around the moon and resource-rich asteroids. Because although the Outer Space Treaty says that states can't claim territory as their own, how you define claiming and how you define states is not really clear. Does a commercial company that may or may not be operating on behalf of the state going to the moon where there's a resource area and claiming that resource, does that involve claiming territory? And if they're going to protect that claim, if they bring in private security contractors, not military forces, but private security contractors that nevertheless have the ability to protect a claim, how does that sit with the Outer Space Treaty? So I do think that things like the Artemis Accords are a first step in this process of how do we update our reform, our governance, and our space law issues going forward to really ensure that when we do go to the moon to utilize lunar resources, we do it in a sensible and controlled manner. Mars, obviously, as I said, is still out there. I am skeptical that we'd get to Mars in the 2030s. Mars is a huge order of magnitude more difficult than going to the moon. I do think that it's so far distant in terms of the time it will take to get there. I'm talking there about developing the capability to do so rather than the voyage itself and the distance. Then I think probably the late 2030s and the early 2040s is a much more sensible ambition in terms of desire to get to Mars at that point. But we have to do lunar operations first. We have to have a sustained presence on the lunar surface. We have to learn how to exploit in situ resources and test technology essential to go to Mars. I do think that we are going to be forced to go down the path of nuclear space power and propulsion if we want to go to Mars. Talking about chemical rockets and gravity assist is a non-starter in my belief, because you're just magnifying the biomedical and psychological challenges needlessly. There should be a crash effort to develop spacecraft nuclear power and nuclear propulsion. And Australia needs to contribute to the Mars goals as well. And I think, once again, we can develop the biomedical, the remote operations. We can even develop nuclear expertise to be able to possibly contribute to nuclear-propelled spacecraft going down that path. But I think Mars is out there, it's important. And I think from my perspective, it's not just about the settlement of Mars or landing on Mars, which will be a huge human achievement. It's about Mars as a stepping stone to deeper human exploration later this century. It's about getting humans out to Ceres or out to the moons of Jupiter or out to the moons of Saturn. because we can't get waylaid at Mars and stop at Mars. And I think that if you really want to think 100 years down the track to 2120, I would like to see humans spread across the solar system, and I don't see any reason why we can't do that. But we have to really accelerate how we do space exploration, and commercial space sector, I think, is going to be really critical in that. Now, I'll stop there. I've probably spoken long enough, but I'm happy to engage in discussion and questions. And once again, I thank you for the time to present. Thank you very much. I can't hear you, Peter. Peter, you're muted. You're muted, Peter. There we go.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, I must have hit it too fast. Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Malcolm. I've got many questions myself, but I'm not going to indulge too much, but I'm going to ask one or two. I've got a question here from John Lee. Do you foresee a role for the space equivalent of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and what would that look like?
Look, I think that, you know, when we talk about arms control in space, it's more challenging than nuclear weapons here on Earth. With nuclear weapons, arms control, you can easily identify an ICBM, you can identify a ballistic missile submarine, or count a bomber carrying nuclear weapons. How do you define what a space weapon is? When a space weapon could be anything from a destructive kinetic kill ASAT that can be launched from the Earth to a cyber attack on a satellite. How do we manage and moderate the development of soft kill capabilities when remote proximity, rendezvous and proximity operations of the sort that the Chinese and the Russians are doing at the moment, quite legitimately can be used in commercial rendezvous, commercial spacecraft refueling and repair missions for the commercial sector. The same profile can be used for a co-orbital ASAT attack on a satellite. How do we manage to deal with dazzling laser capabilities fired from Earth against a satellite? So defining what a space weapon is really difficult. You know, if you maneuver your CubeSat that's died or is about to die and crash it into another satellite, is that a space attack, or is that simply an accident? How do we know when a satellite goes down? Is that just a mechanical or a systems failure, or is that a cyber attack on that satellite? So it's really challenging to do space arms control. I'm not saying it's impossible, and we should be thinking about how we develop arms control for space, but I think the focus should initially be on, firstly, mitigating the threat through space resilience. So making it more difficult for an adversary to use space weapons effectively. At the moment, we have all our critical national security satellites in a small number of very large satellites. You know, they're huge Winnebago-sized platforms that have large sensors, and they're very complex and they're very expensive, and so they stay up there for a very long time. If you diversify and disaggregate those capabilities across many smaller satellites, it becomes more difficult for an adversary to take out that capability with an anti-satellite attack. And secondly, rapid reconstitution. The ability to rapidly put up satellites to replace lost capability in the event of a counter space attack makes it more difficult for that adversary. And so in the end, you reduce the incentive for that adversary to use space weapons. And at that point, combined with you know, new developments in space law and governance and so forth, you say to that adversary, look, you're not really going to gain anything politically or strategically or tactically by using space weapons because it's going to fail. So let's then talk about arms control in space. And you shape the environment, you make it conducive to talk about arms control in space, rather than trying to do arms control in space when you can't verify or monitor it, you can't implement it, and the other side has no incentive to sign up to it. So I think that the answer to the question is yes, down the track, once we've got the right environment in place to be able to make it work.
Okay, this is another question, a little bit, I think you touched on it before, but from Rami Mando. How do you see nuclear pulse propulsion working in space when there are space treaties about nuclear weapons in space? And does this introduce new risks?
Well, I know what Ramey's talking about. He's talking about Orion, the Project Orion. I don't think people are looking at that. I think they're looking at nuclear thermal or nuclear electric propulsion, which is different. So it's not about letting off nuclear bombs behind a spacecraft to propel it along. It's about using a nuclear reactor to generate thrust at a higher specific impulse compared to chemical rockets. Project Orion, when it was first conceived of, would have got us to the moons of Jupiter with a crew of 100 people by the 1970s. But of course, it would have involved letting off lots of nuclear bombs in space, and that was not necessarily a good thing. Also, the Outer Space Treaty kind of made it impossible. Nuclear thermal and nuclear electric propulsion and nuclear power for spacecraft opens up all sorts of possibilities that is much more useful. I was reading the other day that there's now a push for a mission back to Neptune and a Neptune orbiter. And they're talking conventional rockets with gravity assist. It takes 30 years to get out there. Stupid. Let's go down the path of nuclear propulsion and get out there in 5 years. I'm not a space engineer, so my assumptions may be wrong there, but I do know that a higher specific impulse gets you out there, gets you a better delta V to get you out there faster, and gives you more power then to decelerate and go into orbit. And once you're in orbit, you have that power to do more rather than relying on a small RTG to power your spacecraft. So I do think that nuclear propulsion is a technology that really is overdue, and we should have gone down that path a long time ago.
Sure. I've got a few more questions coming. I'm just going to slip a couple in of my own, if you wouldn't mind. You did mention before the Woomera manual. Could you elaborate on what that means? And also, my second question, before I forget, is in all the Artemis discussions, and a friend of mine raised this subject, we haven't really heard much or anything about the deep space communication. As you know, back in Apollo, Australia played a very critical role, largely because of its geographical location. But there's been really nothing said about our contribution that we might be able to make to that Artemis. So two points.
Well, look, I can see, to get into the second one, in terms of deep space communications, Australia plays a really vital role in terms of deep space communications with distant spacecraft, be they space probes like Voyager and other space probes, or crewed missions. And I would imagine with Artemis, there would be a strong incentive for government to invest money in our ground-based facilities, to expand those, to ensure we don't have a scenario like in the dish where a major windstorm makes it almost impossible to see that landing. Look, I think that we have a strong role to play in terms of those ground-based facilities. They're vital in terms of their location, in terms of supporting activities in space, and we should be expanding those as a matter of course. Now, your first question, sorry, was
about the Woomera manual you mentioned.
Oh, the Woomera manual, yeah. It's a really vital project designed to update governance structures, space law, regulatory arrangements to deal with the increasing challenge posed by weaponization of space. It's being led by the University of Adelaide, but it's an international project amongst many different universities and higher education sectors. And it's really an important effort to try and open up some discussion and some debate as to how we make our space law and our space governance relevant to the 21st century. And I think that the University of Adelaide Woomera Manual is something that the Space Association of Australia should be having a meeting on, and maybe having someone from the University of Adelaide have a presentation on that.
Sounds good. That's wonderful. I've got a couple of more questions come in. Look, I'll just read that as it's written. I haven't sort of gone in to distill exactly what's going on. So this is from Gabe Bolton. Signals intelligence is discussed very briefly in the report, I assume your report he's referring to, and is only explicitly discussed in the context of a single US commercial RF analysis provider, Hawkeye 360. How do you think the Space 2.0 proliferation of small sat constellations and associated increase in data links will impact the signals intelligence ecosystem? and how do you think this will impact the domestic small sat companies such as Skycraft and agencies such as the ASD?
Well, I was actually lucky enough when I was in Washington at one point to have a chat with the Hawkeye 360 people. And it's really fascinating that they're doing commercial SIGINT. You know, I'm not sure how that works. But nevertheless, you do have a commercial company building spacecraft to do SIGINT. And Australia, I think, is doing something similar. For the name of the company that's doing it here in Australia has escaped my mind. But I know we are going down that path. And the potential for utilising satellites to do SIGINT is really important and obviously a step forward in the future.
Sorry, just what's SIGINT for the novices amongst us?
SIGINT, signals intelligence.
Okay, sorry.
The potential, for example, with mega constellations to have lots of small satellites monitoring radio traffic or signals emissions across the globe, obviously maybe creates some privacy concerns in terms of how do you stop governments from monitoring your private communications. But at the same time, if you're in terms of countering international terrorism, it opens up new ways to do that or to monitor the activities of adversaries. So I think that, yes, Australia should be able to go down this path and develop these sorts of capabilities in the future.
Wonderful. Another one from a contributor called Mars Nunn. The more satellites in a constellation, the harder it is to attack that constellation successfully. Even GPS, which only has 30-something satellites, degrades very slowly, and you have to take out a lot of GPS satellites in order to denigrate the GPS signal significantly. I guess you just agree with that statement?
Broadly, but I think we've got to remember with GPS that its role is to provide positioning, navigation, and timing. A lot of people, when they think about GPS, focus on the positioning side of things in terms of and the navigation, in terms of where you navigate your vehicle across a terrain or getting a smart weapon to hit a target with high precision. What the most important role of GPS is the timing function, which is critical to modern network command and control. If you take out a sufficient number of satellites, you can make it impossible for us to use modern command and control capabilities. Our ability to gain network-centric warfare and a common operating picture and pass signals at high speed using digital methods across command and control structures falls apart very quickly. And so I think
it's not quite true, because there's been a study that shows that you need to take out a very large number of GPS satellites to degrade the constellation significantly. It's Dr. Len Halperin here, and I worked in DSTO and we did studies on this. Yeah. And it shows that you can achieve holes in GPS over short coverage areas for short times where you can move assets around and GPS won't see you by taking out 1, 2, or 3 satellites. But in order to get even about a 70% degradation of the constellation, you've got to take out about half the satellites. Mm-hmm. So it's not realistic, and we're talking 30-something. So with these mega constellations of thousands of satellites, they're virtually going to be impervious.
Well, you say it's not realistic, but remember, we're talking the potential for soft kill here, utilizing cyber attack or directed energy weapons or electronic warfare. So yes, if we're talking physical attack using kinetic kill ASATs, it becomes more difficult. But if you're talking about cyber attack on a constellation, it's not impossible. Or cyber attack on the ground facility controlling that constellation. So I would be very hesitant to suggest that a satellite constellation is impervious or difficult to kill. An adversary will find a way, and we can't make the assumption that GPS is always going to be there and will be uninterrupted. And that's my point. I think that we do need to have the ability to reconstitute lost capability in the event of attack, or make it more difficult for that adversary to kill a constellation. And that could mean disaggregating capabilities across other satellites. It could mean utilizing new approaches such as quantum technology to be able to complement GPS so that we're not so reliant on GPS. And I think that's really important.
Fantastic. We've got a few more questions to go through. We're gonna cut it off in about 5 minutes, just for everyone's understanding. We've got more questions than we can possibly answer, but perhaps, Malcolm, we might package these up and send them off to you, and maybe we can answer them in another form in some way, maybe via a Facebook page or something like that. Okay, we've got one from Stephen Humble. Does Australia's nuclear power ban limit our ability to work on hybrid nuclear thermal or nuclear electric propulsion systems or surface power?
Yeah, look, I think that's a valid question, and it's a concern. If you want my personal opinion, the nuclear power ban is daft. It ignores the potential benefits of nuclear power for dealing with climate change. It ignores the potential opportunities that nuclear power gives us for future generations of future submarines if we wanted to go down that path. No one is suggesting that we're going to get nuclear weapons, okay? But if we were to be able to develop civil nuclear power or develop greater research into nuclear power, then we could contribute more directly to the current efforts in the US and elsewhere, to develop spacecraft nuclear power and propulsion. We can't keep on going down the path that we had in the 70s of chemical rockets and gravity assist. That's useful for some missions, but if we're talking about getting astronauts out to Mars, we want to get them out as quickly as possible. Don't have a 6-month transit. Try and get them out there a lot faster. Or if we were talking about getting a complex, large space probe out to the outer planets, so let's get it out there so that the scientists that built it are still alive when it gets there. So I think that, and then when it gets there, it can do a lot because it's got loads of power, as opposed to not do much or do a very limited flyby. I think that spacecraft nuclear power and propulsion is an idea whose time has come, and Australia needs to overlook the sum of ignorant attitudes that we have about nuclear power based on fear more than anything else. We are the most seismically stable country on the planet, and we have one of the best regulated power industries on the planet. There's no way that we are going to allow either a Chernobyl or a Fukushima to have it happen in this country. So I see no reason why we shouldn't break down that ban on nuclear power and start to reap the benefits in so many different areas.
Beautiful. All right. Look, we've got Alice Gorman who's presenting next, but what I thought I would do is give her the last, an opportunity to maybe make a comment or ask you a question, because Alice, for people that don't know, is on the Advisory Council for the Space Industry Association of Australia. So, Alice, would you like to make any comments? Unmute your microphone and ask Malcolm, or make a comment or a question or statement.
Before Alice starts, I have to ask, how's your theremin going, Alice? Is it working well?
Oh, Malcolm, I have to confess I've been a bit slack with practice, so our theremin off might not be going to happen.
We were expecting a concert after the presentation.
This will be incentive to get back into it. Thank you very much, Malcolm, for that very insightful overview of a whole range of different Australian space sectors. I think launch is particularly interesting, to come back to something that you started with, because once it was a forte, Australia had developed its own sounding rockets. We had the cliches, one of the busiest rocket launch sites in the world in the 60s. And then we just let that all slip away. And at the moment we have a resurgence. We have rockets being developed, we have rocket launch sites being developed, and it looks like we are very, very definitely back in the launch market. But I think indications are that some of that cultural cringe or technological cringe around the idea of launch is still lurking around in little corners of government. And we're actually at a bit of a crisis point, because we had the review of the legislation that was then changed. The idea was it was going to be much easier for Australians to launch small satellites and to have our own launch capability again. But the government has a left hand and a right hand, and the right hand is saying, yes, remove the barriers to participation in these industries, and the left hand is saying, we want full cost recovery on all launch fees, on all licensing fees, which will price all of these small players, or, well, in fact, not even the small ones, which will price us out of our own market. And this seems to be at the moment at a little bit of an impasse. It looks like the the massive expense to get licensed to launch side is winning at the moment. So we've got so much exciting stuff going on, but we're not out of the water yet. And I think there's still, it's the weirdest thing. I've been thinking about this for ages. My conclusion is, after we sort of let things slide, the 70s, Australian government particularly came to believe that Australians don't deserve, in some bizarre way, don't deserve to have launch capability, which is some sort of deep-seated cultural thing I'm still trying to untangle. So I think there's so much exciting stuff going on, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I do have many questions for Malcolm, but I won't ask them now. Maybe I'll ask them as we're both playing the theremin.
Me and my synthesizer, you on your theremin. Sounds good.
All right. Well, just to stay on time, we'll call that part of the session closed. Thank you so much, Malcolm. It was fascinating. As I say, I've got a dozen questions written here myself, and I'm sure everyone else on the panel on the session has many questions themselves. So thank you so much. You're more than welcome to stay around for the rest of the evening, and often we have a lot of people hang around after the official end of it at 9:30, so maybe we can have a roundtable chat at that stage. Fantastic. All right, if I'm just going to grab the desktop and just introduce Alice, and then we'll throw it over to you, Alice. If you don't
Thank
mind.
you, Peter.
I'll just try and work out how to do this again. Oh, share screen. There we go. Brilliant. All right, you should have a black screen. All right, so as you have already heard, our next speaker will be Alice Gorman, and I'm not progressing on my presentation here. Let me just check something. Here we go. All right. So yes, by way of introduction, Alice is an internationally recognised leader in the emerging field of space archaeology. She's had many awards, including the 2017 University of New South Wales Press Bragg Prize winner for science writing, faculty member of the International Space University, worked extensively in Indigenous heritage management, and also specialist in stone tool analysis, which is fascinating, and the Aboriginal use of bottle glass after European settlement. That's amazing. A member of the Executive Council of the Space Industry Association, as we mentioned, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and a council of the Anthropological Society of South Australia. Shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier Prize Literary Awards in 2020 this year. And I'm not going to read all these out. Multiple awards.
Please read them all out.
Sure. Shortlisted, etc. Alice has published a book called Dr. Space Junk vs. the Universe, and is available at newsouthbooks.com.au. So welcome, Alice, and I will stop sharing and I'll allow you to share your screen, and we'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a hard act to follow, Malcolm, and my topic is very different, although there are some points of intersection. So hopefully my screen share is going to work, which means let me see if I can make this work. Can anybody see anything yet?
We can just see you. We can't see your screen. We can see everyone else as well. So there's a green tab at the bottom saying share screen.
Yeah, no, I'm in that. This
okay, got it. Yes.
Okay,
so we've now got the preview of your presentation, not the actual presentation itself. So.
Okay, how does that look?
Perfect. And I'll mute myself. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to the Space Association gathering. I'd like, first of all, to acknowledge that I speak to you today from Wiradjuri country, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all of the traditional owners of the different countries that we're all present from at this time. So Peter's kindly allowed me to talk tonight about an initiative of the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, which is called Space for Women. And the idea is that it will address some of the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, which we are attempting to reach by the year 2030. So the Space for Women project is specifically looking at goals 4, education, and 5, gender equality. And one of the major aims is to encourage girls and women to get involved in STEM. So this relates very much to our capacity to grow our space-related workforce in Australia, as Malcolm outlined early in his talk. So just a bit of a global snapshot, and I will also say apologies to people who've seen some of this before. So globally, we have only about 30% of the world's STEM researchers are female, 35% only of students who are enrolled in STEM high degree education. And a figure that I'm sure everybody knows, as in the academic world, as you go higher up in the hierarchy, the numbers of women fall off. So the higher you get, the fewer women there are. Particularly in the space sector globally, at the moment, 566 people have been into space, but only 11.5% of those have been women. And we were, of course, thinking about this last week, which was the anniversary of Valentina Tereshkova's Orbit of the Earth, the first woman to go into space. So it took till 2019 before there were enough women and enough spacesuits that fit for 2 women to actually do a spacewalk together. So you can see we've still got a long way to go in the human spaceflight realm. Globally, in space industry, women represent 20 to 22% of the workforce and 19% of the leadership of that workforce. So we're looking at quite a large gender imbalance here. There we go. Apologies if my slide transitions aren't that amazing. So some of the reasons to make sure women have a strong presence and voice in space is there's some economic reasons, and there's also some very fundamental stuff. The more education and the more say in things women have, the better this is for the entire global population. So even at this very broad level, stepping outside space, there are a whole lot of reasons to be concerned about that gender disparity and to be concerned about doing the things that we can to try and reduce it. Some of the causes of the gender gap in the STEM fields, these are multiple, and they start, back when at the stage of people being little kids and go right to the end of people's career. But just a couple of things I'd like to pick out here. One in particular is lack of encouragement that girls and women get from their peers, their teachers, their mentors, the people around them, to start a career in STEM or to stay in a career in STEM. Something that really stuck in my mind was a conversation I had recently with Greg Waugh, who runs a wonderful podcast called Smart Enough to Know Better. I mean, we're talking about our experience at high school, and he said that I think he's a bit younger than me, but when he was at school, if you were a boy and you were doing pretty well at maths, science, STEM-y things, then it was just sort of automatically assumed that engineering was a career path for you. And when he said that, it just struck me forcibly that in my entire high school and university career, where I took sciences and STEM subjects consistently and also did well in them, no one ever said that to me. Not ever, not even once. So just something as simple like that environment can really make a huge difference to the career choices that girls make. There's some other stuff in there too, but I'm sure people are quite familiar with a lot of these reasons. Now I have to go. So what the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs has done is set up this Space for Women program, which is part of a multi-pronged approach to trying to get more women into STEM. So this means we are particularly interested in Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is about education, and Sustainable Development Goal 5, particularly about gender equality. But Simonetta Di Pippo, who is the director of UNUSA, has made the point that of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 40% of the targets identified across all of them have some space component. So it's not just about these two, it's actually about the whole range of Sustainable Development Goals. So, oh dear, something's gone awry there. So some of the actions that UNUSA is undertaking in order to meet these targets include particularly the Space for Women Mentor Network, which I am now a part of. And this is, it's a trial, it's the first time it's been run. So there's 35 women in different parts of the world who are being supported by the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs to sort of go out there and try and make a difference to women in their regions, women and girls in their regions, to increase their participation in STEM. Well, let's not worry about that one. So what I want to do now is just very quickly give a little bit of context for women in Australian space industry. So I'm going to start with this amazing painting by the Kamilaroi artist Stella Wheeldon, which depicts the Seven Sisters. The Seven Sisters is, in Aboriginal astronomy, is the Pleiades constellation. And there are numerous ceremonial cycles and very important cultural knowledge related to the Seven Sisters that is particularly relevant for women as well. And interestingly, the landscape around the Woomera launch range was all created by the actions of the Seven Sisters and the old man who was chasing them. So we have this sort of deep connection back into Indigenous astronomy that connects us to space in Australia. Space in Australia really starts with the establishment of Woomera in the immediate post-war period. And of course, it's the 1940s and 50s, and we know what expectations of gender roles were in those days. But it's really interesting that the first engagement of women in space was not as participants, but as protesters. So when Woomera was being established, there was a nationwide protest movement, which was spearheaded by women's groups and also by Aboriginal activist groups who were looking for self-determination, because the Woomera rocket launch range meant the displacement of many groups of traditional owners. So both for white women and Aboriginal women, their first encounter with space was actually in this context of promoting peace and Aboriginal rights. I think that's a very important part of our story. As Woomera began to be established, it was very male dominated. So in 1948, which is when it was actually being built, there were 1,200 men and only 8 women, all in the catering hospitality side of things. As things progressed, women were incredibly interested in getting employed at Woomera, but their primary roles there were seen as computers. And I'm sure many of you know this story. This is something that happened across the world. So this is before mechanical or electronic computers. People had to do all these calculations by hand, and it was seen as very appropriate for women because women were good at doing boring, menial, repetitive tasks. So this was the role that they played at Woomera. And you can see in that picture some kini theodolite operators as well. But the other thing here was the only Aboriginal women who got a look in was as part of Australia's assimilation policy. They were allowed to be domestic servants because that was the height of aspiration that any Aboriginal woman could have. So this is the place that women in Australia are coming to from when they're trying to get a greater level of participation in these industries. I've just got a couple more things to say. These graphs here come from SAGE, and they show the orange lines are men, the yellow lines are women, and they show that thing we mentioned before, the decline of the number of women, the higher the level you go, which is on the right-hand side of the graph. These figures were in 2014, but as far as I know, not much has changed since then. If we have a look at Australian space specifically, some more precise figures come from the Australian Space Research Conference, which is held every year. So some of us did a little study of participation in this conference from 2015 through to 2018. These are figures from 2017. So we found that roughly 30% of participants in this conference were women. And the important thing was getting women there. Once they were there, they were more likely to be presenting and they were more likely to win awards. So the battle was just thinking of ways to just get women at the conference to begin with. And if we look at space industry, a major study done in 2015 found that 16% of the workforce were women. So this is half of what it appears to be at the global level. We're not doing too well here. A couple more interesting things to note. The Space Industry Association, which I'm currently on the advisory council of, but I was the deputy chair of the board the last couple of years. So we've gone from having representation on the board, 1 woman in 2017, that was me, to 4 women in 2020, which is fantastic, whereas the advisory council has stayed more or less the same. I do have to get some updated figures on the number of startup companies which have been started by women. There were at least 3 or 4, and there's probably more now. And coming back to Malcolm's point about Australians in space, we do currently have a Mars 1 astronaut candidate, Diane McGrath. I know lots of people are very skeptical about Mars 1 and, you know, not without justification, but this actually is an Australian woman who is training and investigating how to be an astronaut on Mars. And if any of you have met her, she's very impressive, a very thoughtful person. So it would be great if we had some more of that. Now, I think I'm nearly... So I just want to finish this, first of all, to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing as a Space for Women mentor. So I have sort of a small group of, at this stage, young women in space who I am working with to help them stay in space and go further. I've been in discussions with the National Space Society Women in Space chapter, and we're talking about having a wikithon to make sure that all those Australian space women actually have a Wikipedia page, which will make them more visible, which will be beneficial for them personally, but will also mean that that information is out there for anyone else who is seeking it. We're also talking to Troy McCann at Moonshot about running some specific sessions for women in Australian space. One is a CV workshop, and there's a few other things we're talking about. And last week, I published an article in The Conversation which talks about women in space in sort of historical and present circumstances, and a little bit about the Space for Women program as well. So I'm trying to sort of get this message out into the media. But the reason I was so happy when Peter invited me to come and talk about this is what I really want to do as a Space for Women mentor is find out what people need, find out what people's ideas are, what you would like to have, get your ideas and suggestions for future activities. So I would absolutely love it if anybody at tonight's gathering had any ideas they would like to share with me, and questions about the program, I would also be very happy to answer them. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Alice. That was wonderful. We do have a question that's just come in from Kate Barnard. What is men's role in improving the gender balance in the space industry, in your opinion? That's
a great question. So I can say that there are a lot of men out there in space industry who are very committed to this goal, who are really, really supportive. They want to see more women doing things, and you know, they do their best to make sure that happens, and that's really encouraging to me. But I can also tell you that a lot of these same men, who are often my dear friends, who I respect and love, can do just the most ridiculously sexist things without even thinking about it, because that's the world we live in, you know? So it's not that they're trying to be exclusive or trying to make anyone's life difficult. that's just the culture and the environment that we're in. So something that I think is really important, and I have been thinking about the best way to do that, is to, I don't know, educate a lot of my male colleagues about all of those tiny little things that seem trivial when they happen, but all add up to creating barriers for women to have a real voice around the table. So at the moment, my thoughts around that are I'm going to write a long thing, which will kind of be, I'm sure you've all seen articles and blog posts, which are like, here are the 10 ways that you can help create a more gender equal world. So I was thinking of doing something a bit like that for space, but I would love people who have any ideas, because I think this is a critical part of the process and the equation, finding ways that we can recruit our male colleagues to actually change things about the world so that we can get to this goal that we want.
We have a question, it might be from Malcolm actually. You should approach the ASPI, the Australian Space Policy Institute, or strategic for promoting NSS Women in Space workshops through the Women in Defence and National Security. So I think that comes from Malcolm, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, she's nodding. Yeah. So maybe you two can work that out. A couple more questions. I did want to say something else, and it's by no means a comment, but if you look at tonight's presentation or session, and also the members of the Space Association, it's predominantly men. And we haven't excluded anybody. And it's just an interesting observation, I guess. I'm not trying to make a point, but, you know, as I say, 99%, 95% perhaps tonight are men on the session, but I'll leave it hang there. I've got a couple more, unless you want to make a comment on that or attack me.
Oh, well, this is a problem sort of across the space world, really. And this stuff, it starts with kids and it goes all the way up. Like you can't change one bit, you have to change everything at once. But I think this is kind of the point where we start, isn't it? It's thinking, well, okay, here's the part of the world that I have some influence over. What can I do about that? And I think one thing that can be effective is when you seek people out, and so the kind of thing is, if you do nothing, it will stay the same. So you have to take some action to make it different. And in this kind of case, perhaps that action is identifying people who you specifically invite to attend, and they may be able to do it or they may not be able to do that. But just a simple thing like that can kind of tip that balance from, I'm not explaining this very well, but hopefully you know what I mean. But I think that you've raised a really important point, and this is something the Space Industry Association has had to consider, that the South Australian Space Forum has had to consider as well. It's something that we can do better across a whole range of fronts. So I think that's an important point.
I've got a couple, well, I've got several coming in. I'll probably only have time for one more, because we actually have a woman next to present tonight. So we're delivering. This comment is, how can we engage young women who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, underprivileged backgrounds, who aim to work in the space sector?
That's also a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I guess I come from a university, Flinders University, which caters to, I can't remember the name, there's like an SE3 or something, but caters to people from poorer areas of Adelaide, pretty much. We get lots of first-in family people. We got lots of people who are sort of fairly poorly resourced to do that. So that's something that I think about a lot as well. And some of this too, people say this all the time, but it's true. You can't be what you can't see. So one thing that can be done is to be visible to those communities, is to make sure that, and you know, we're in this amazing world now where I've always wanted to come to one of your meetings, but I've never been in Melbourne at the right time. And suddenly here I am. So we have all of this technology now that could actually assist us to reach to some of those communities in ways that was much more difficult before. But I think that is a critical part of it as well. Really good question.
Peter, Mike Tobin here.
Mike.
Can I just make a comment about encouraging girls to be interested in space? Good evening, Alice.
Hello, Brad.
How are you? I think that I think there are some girls' schools, or at least one girls' school in Adelaide, that is very positive about educating girls about space technology. And one of the possibilities, and I've done this at my old school, is to offer a scholarship for a girl that may not be able to attend that school, who has an interest in space matters, space science of any kind. So I think if we make these educational opportunities available to young women at the school level, a number of those perhaps will go on to tertiary level. Alice, what do you think?
I think it'd be fantastic to start a scholarship specifically for that purpose. So that might definitely be something to maybe mobilise a bunch of people around, because obviously it takes a fair bit of money to sustain something like that. But I think that's a great idea. And I might also add in this, so it's not just enough to get women there. We have to stop the boys giving them a hard time. So as Kate mentioned, so one of the big issues for women doing engineering degrees is the shit they get from their male fellow students, who are a big part of the problem. So we have to do something about that stuff as well. We can get them into an aerospace engineering degree at university. And I actually had a student come to me wanting to do archaeology, and she said, what's the gender balance in the course? I was like, well, it's kind of 60-40, 60 female, 40 male. And she said, that's fantastic. She had a friend who was in engineering, one of the 10% in that particular class. And she had a horrible time. So we can't just get them there. We have to get rid of the banter, all of that crap. Anyway, but I think I love the idea of a scholarship. So maybe we could have a chat, Brett, and I could pick your brains a bit more.
Peter, Mike Tobin.
Okay, this is the last question, everybody.
Sorry, Mike.
Hi. I'm also on the board of Technorama, which looks after the technicians involved in community radio. And when we have our annual conference, we set aside funds for accommodation and travel for female participants to come into the conference. Just a little thing we do, which makes it easier for them to come as against all the male staff that seem to get sponsored by their stations.
That's brilliant. What a fantastic initiative. I'm very happy to know about that.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks again, Alice. That was wonderful. Please stay on and we'll probably have some time to chat afterwards. We've got a pile of questions coming through. So once again, we will get those off to you and somehow we'll share the answers from those.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm just about to stop. There we go.
Perfect. All right. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll bring on Vienna. And just get to this.
Have I got time to grab a quick drink?
You sure? Well, possibly. Yeah, I'm going to talk for about 2 minutes. So yeah, it's all good. Okay. All right. That was great. Fantastic. And as usual, there's never enough time. So to deliver one of our KPIs and to try to do our little bit to promote equality and encouraging people, we've got a student named Vienna Tran joining us, and I'll just do a couple of slides. She's done some amazing things for her young age, and the quote there that I saw from her Twitter feed, I think it was, she met I think she met Charlie Bolden and was really inspired, and that's a fantastic. So she's done a lot of things in her short number of years. She's currently combining honours degree with her medical degree at the University of Adelaide. Professional interests include aerospace medicine, remote medicine, and planetary health. Alongside her studies, she's a student mentor, private tutor, and public speaker. And her thesis involves analysing data from the AgBreezer. So I'm going to let Vienna explain what AgBreezer is. So Vienna, I see you there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand the floor over to you, if I can get to it. Stand by. Where are we? Oh, here we are. Stop sharing. There we go. And Vienna, you're there. I can see you.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Peter.
Pleasure.
Hi, everyone. So, do I share my screen now?
You can go ahead and start sharing your screen whenever you like. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Let's see how this goes. Can everyone see my screen?
No, we can just see you at this stage.
Technology.
It's starting. There we go. We've got your preview PowerPoint. There we go. That's it. Perfect.
Excellent. Okay.
I'll go ahead and mute myself.
All right. I thank you, everyone, for coming to spend your evenings with me. Sorry that it's a little bit late in the day for some people in the country, but my name is Vienna Tran, and today I'm talking about my honours project, which is lay titled The Effects of Centrifugation on the Gluteal Muscles During 60-Day Bed Rest. Just a little bit about me. I'm a medical student at the University of Adelaide. I'm expected to finish next year, but I am taking this year off to do an honours in health and medical sciences. In that photo over there, I am at the International Space University Southern Hemisphere Space Studies program, and me and a team of 3 other people have built a rocket in about the space of a week. And inside the nose cone there is a payload of a champagne glass. We launched that rocket about 300 meters into the air and recovered the payload safely with a parachute. So it was a great challenge and a great collaboration, one of my favorite parts of the program. So tonight's presentation is going to be structured as follows. I know I'm speaking to a lot of space enthusiasts tonight, so I'm going to relate the background information to as much space stuff as possible, and then relate it later to medicine in the application section. And so after the background, I'll be talking about the method of the study and the preliminary results. I really welcome any and all questions in the Slido app. So my first question for you to think about: what do beds, butts, and the Blue Danube have in common? Tune in at the end for the answer. So I want to start with this comparison of photos. We have had about 60 years of human spaceflight history, starting from Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight on the 12th of April, 1961, the first human ever to go into space. And 60 years on, we have the first commercial crew, Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, entering the ISS, a really momentous occasion, which I actually tuned in for with SAA. So that was really inspiring. And over that long period of time, we have developed a lot in terms of our space life sciences research and knowledge. But if we are to set foot on the moon and later on Mars, as NASA and many other organizations are hoping, then we have a lot of a longer way to go in terms of the research that we need to do to keep our astronauts safe and healthy. Now, one of the interesting things about space life sciences research is that we have a very low sample size. Not many people have been to space, and it's very expensive and overall difficult to send people into space to do research. So, how do we solve that problem? Well, we do something called analogues, and analogues are a way to replicate certain aspects of spaceflight on the human body on Earth. You might have heard of the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah, or the proposed Mars Oz habitat in Arkaroola in SA. And those are analogues mainly for the social and behavioural aspects of spaceflight. Since you're in such a confined environment, people want to study psychology between members. But we also have analogues for microgravity, and we can do that right here on our soil. On the left here is bed rest, which is probably the most popular analog. We have in this laboratory a person lying down in a bed. When they do that, then they take the weight off the legs and the hips. So there's not any weight that's sort of sustaining them. And so it's as if you were in a microgravity environment. The reason that the person is slightly tilted back at 6 degrees down, in fact, is because that position has been shown to be a more accurate representation of what microgravity does to the fluids and muscles in the body, compared to if you were lying flat. On the right here, we have dry immersion, which I think is a less comfortable way of doing an analog, where it essentially involves a bath with water in it, and the person lies on a plastic sheet above the water to stay dry, hence dry immersion, and the buoyancy of the water simulates the microgravity. So you can see here that we are able to, in a way, represent or replicate the effects of microgravity on the body. So what does AGBRESA mean exactly? It's a funny acronym. It stands for Artificial Gravity Bed Rest at the European Space Agency. This was a project that was completed in December of last year. And here's its mission patch on the right. You can see that it was a collaboration between NASA, ESA, and the German Aerospace Center, or DLR. Here's a news clipping from CNN, which basically encompasses the study. Space scientists want to pay you almost $19,000. Sounds pretty sweet. I'm not finished yet. To lie in bed, pretty good, for 2 months. Now, if you're anything like me and survive the coronavirus pandemic, I think I would go clinically insane if I had to lie in bed for 2 months. But that's what 24 healthy volunteers did for this study. Now, this is a real setup, a real picture inside the laboratory at DLR of one volunteer being placed in bed for 60 full days. Now, during the study, some volunteers were controlled, so they had to stay in bed the whole time. But the other volunteers were placed in a human-sized centrifuge. A centrifuge is a rotating device that generates an outward force on the object inside it, in this case, a human. And so it's rotating at such a rate that it generates 1 G at the level of the heart. And this is to help replicate the Earth's gravity on the person while they are still lying down. Another question for you. What do you give someone who hasn't moved a muscle in 2 months? A trophy. It's actually pronounced atrophy, but you know, I had to pronounce it for the joke. Muscle atrophy is a phenomenon in which muscles get smaller and weaker due to deloading. So I've written here the examples of muscle deloading in this schematic diagram, where we have a muscle fiber on the left, which is nice and big and healthy, and it doesn't slow down, it gets smaller due to these processes. So these processes can include aging and bed rest, disability, chronic disease, and spaceflight. The mechanism behind this shrinkage is theorized to be a greater rate of protein degradation of the muscle fiber compared to protein synthesis, and we have a resultant degradation, therefore a shrinkage of the muscle. The take home from this is, if you don't use it, you lose it. Aside from atrophy being an indicator of deconditioning and loss of function, we also have something called muscular fat infiltration. This is illustrated in these 3 scans of MRI scans, which is magnetic resonance imaging. It's a way to visualize soft tissue, which includes muscle in a human being. And these are 3 thighs of 3 different male participants in a previous study by McLeod in 2016. If we compare subjects C and D, we have 2 males of equivalent body mass approximately, but one is older than the other. And you can see, just because of age and perhaps a different activity level, we see fat developing in between the muscles, not just on the outside where you can feel it, but in between the muscles themselves, within the muscle fiber. Now we compare subjects D and E. Same age, same body mass, different fat mass, and importantly, different amount of activity levels. So you can see with this 66-year-old male here, there's a lot less fatty infiltration in the muscle compared to the less active 66-year-old. And so from this, we can draw the conclusion that perhaps fat infiltration is a good indicator of deconditioning, loss of function, and reduced activity. So the question then arises, can this be seen in spaceflight? Well, the hypothesis is yes, it can be seen in people who have been in space. We might be able to see increased fatty infiltration for people who have not been loading their muscles during spaceflight. AgBRIZA is a very big study. There were multiple research groups working on the same 24 volunteers looking at different factors. And I'm looking at one small part of that, and that is the gluteal muscles. I've circled it over here for those who don't know. The gluteal muscles are the butt muscles. So, or the bottom, whatever you want to call it. In this diagram by Gooden, we can see that there's an increased loss of muscle volume the further you're down the person. So there's a 20% loss of calf volume over a 4 to 7 week duration on Mir or the shuttle. On the right here, I have another diagram of the gluteal muscles, the gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus would be behind these two. It's not actually illustrated. So the aims of this study are firstly how bed rest affects muscle health through the parameters of volume and fat infiltration. And secondly, how does artificial gravity affect muscle volume and fat infiltration? So there's two different aims that I'm looking at the same sort of muscle health. The design is as follows. There are two independent variables, one being time and one being whether you received artificial gravity or not. This is how the protocol goes. Pre-bed rest, we to do an MRI 48 hours before the 60 days of bed rest to get a baseline. And then after the 60 days, they also get an MRI to see how the trial affected them. Within the bed rest, there are three groups. One of them is the control, who received no centrifugation. The second one would have received supine or lying down centrifugation at 30 minutes a day, 1G. And the third group would have done the same thing, but in 6 bouts of 5 minutes, so with some rest in between. So here's what I get to do as the student. I receive lots and lots of slices of MRIs from all the subjects, and I manually select the outline of the muscle in each slice. And I use a program called MATLAB, which automatically calculates which pixels represent muscle and which pixels represent fat. Just to give you an idea of the scale of it, there are 30 slices per muscle. There are 3 muscles per side. There are 2 sides, and each patient goes through 2 sessions, and there are 24 of them. So there's over 8,000 slices that I need to select. And I paste those values into an Excel document, which is already prepared for me. So it pastes the quartiles of the selection, as well as the fatty infiltration as a fat-water ratio measurement, and the cross-sectional area, which will then represent the volume when I compile it together. So this is my data sheet. So let's look at some preliminary results. I've prepared subject A for you to have a look at, and specifically gluteus maximus, because it's the largest muscle which shows perhaps the biggest changes. So here's one of volume. I have cross-sectional area on the y-axis and the slice number going from low to high on the x-axis. And you can see that before the bed rest, they had a considerable amount of muscle volume, and then it decreases after the 60 days. What we can conclude from this, perhaps, for this subject is that bed rest causes muscle atrophy. Now, the important thing to know is that I don't know whether subject A has undergone centrifugation, so I can't say anything about a full conclusion yet, but I can say this about the atrophy. Similarly, I've got fat-water ratio on the y-axis now, and you can see that compared to before the bed rest, then subject A demonstrates a greater amount of fat compared to water in their gluteus maximus after the trial. So this implies perhaps that there was an increased amount of fat in the muscle after that long 60 days of bed rest. A little bit more data to go. Interestingly, with the other muscles, it's not quite so conclusive. This row here shows the gluteus medius. There is no statistically significant change in either the muscle volume or the fatty infiltration. For gluteus minimus, there was a significant difference in the volume over here, but in terms of the fatty infiltration, not so conclusive. So we don't know what's happened with the other subjects yet, but this is the type of data that I'm going to be going through. So you may be wondering, why don't we solve Earth problems first? Well, with AgBreezer and human life sciences and space life sciences research, we can solve both populations' problems. I want to highlight this graph on the left here. It very clearly shows that the proportion of the Australian population aged 65 and over is increasing as we go along, and it's predicted to get even higher. This is a trend that's observed in most developed countries of today. Now, an increase in the aging population means decrease in productivity levels, decrease in quality of life, and an increased incidence of bedridden and immobility. So this is a problem that is getting ever more present, and if AgBreezer is successful, then it means that we are able to solve problems for not only astronauts, but also terrestrial patients, specifically the aged, the people with chronic diseases, disabilities, injuries, and so on. And so I want to highlight again the reciprocal knowledge transfer between astronauts and terrestrial patients. Research in one column can benefit the other. AgBreezer will help us understand not only how microgravity affects astronauts' gluteal muscles in space, which are important for standing up, but also terrestrial patients, how bed rest affects the gluteal muscles for those who are confined to the bed, who are immobile. And this understanding will help us develop innovations for maintaining muscle mass during long duration space flights, such as from Earth to Mars, which is a long time for an astronaut to be not using their gluteal muscles, which is so important. In addition to that, maybe we could develop new rehabilitation techniques to help patients who are bedbound or elderly get back on their feet. So perhaps we could use artificial gravity as a passive rehabilitation method for people who have had total hip replacements, for example. So now you're probably wondering, what do beds, butts, and the Blue Danube have in common? Well, I've talked about beds, I've talked about butts, and the Blue Danube. Well, I'm just going to leave that spacecraft there. It's a specific and very famous design of a spacecraft which rotates, and that rotation generates artificial gravity for the people living inside it. And some of you might be starting to hear the tune of the Blue Danube creep into your brain as you see that picture. If it's not happening to you, then go and see the movie. So the take-home message is that AgBreezer helps us understand the processes behind muscle deconditioning in a way that has never been done before. We also are able to see whether artificial gravity is a viable way of rehabilitating astronauts and terrestrial patients alike. So it's my hope that as a small part of this study, I can see one day that the first astronaut on Mars will not only be able to stand, but will be able to do so proudly on a strong and healthy pair of glutes. We really do stand on the shoulders of giants. So I would like to acknowledge the support of my supervisors, Gordon and Julie, as well as my other advisors in the team, Nick, Enrico, and Jim from these institutions. Also, thank you to Rowena, Brett, and Dr. Philpott for helping me out and mentoring me as a young student. And thank you to Peter and Michael for having me on the meeting tonight. Really appreciate it. That's all.
Hey, thank you very much. That was wonderful. That was fantastic. So people might have picked up on my first slide that Vienna did some work with the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and I can see now she's also done some glider work, so I love that. All right, Vienna, I've got a few questions coming in, so I'll just go straight to them if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure thing.
This is from Anonymous. I may have missed this, but how many of the study subjects were women and how many were men?
That's a good question. There's only one way to find out, and that's to look at the MRI itself. And I'm not going to do that. I haven't actually counted.
would be part of your conclusions be trying to differentiate the difference between the results that you get from males and females, or that doesn't really matter at this stage of the study?
It would certainly be an interesting talking point. Absolutely. I would definitely try and look at which ones were male and female and try and find some patterns once the data has all been collected.
Okay, wondering why the experimental design required the use of human centrifuge to simulate 1G when standing up could achieve the same effect.
That is a really good question. Now, the centrifuge serves the purpose of a proof of concept of whether the device itself could be used as a passive rehabilitation device. So yes, you could stand someone up and generate 1G, but firstly, what if the terrestrial patient with chronic hip injury cannot stand up? They would need some other way to generate that 1G of force onto their muscles and bones to rehabilitate themselves, because they wouldn't be able to stand up. In terms of astronauts, you can't really just stand the astronaut up in the space station and hope that they load their muscles, because they won't, because they're in the middle of nowhere. So they would require a device such as a centrifuge to generate that same 1G for them to load the muscles and bones and train them to stay strong on the journey.
So I've got a question here, but I'll sort of paraphrase it and expand a little bit. So the study, the actual physical activity, is that happening where you are, or are you just studying the results remotely? And the question is, has there been other results coming?
Yeah, so it's a very, very recent study. It only finished in December last year, and it was in Cologne in Germany. So the results are essentially processed in the UK by Enrico and his team and sent to me remotely. I'm doing the data analysis remotely. I haven't actually been to the facility. If there's in terms of any other data that's come out of it, I think it's too soon to tell. And
just a question for me, I saw those scans and the different profiles. Have you been able to determine whether there's a change in percentage of overall fat, or just the distribution of those fat within the muscle groups? Is there anything that can be gleaned from there?
So are you talking about, if we just talk about the glute max, for example, are you talking about the percentage of fat compared to other materials in the muscle?
Well, yes, the percentage of fat in the body that you're looking at between the start of the study and the end of the study, and also if that stays the same, is the fat distributing itself differently within the body? I'm not sure whether you understand.
I think that's what the quartiles are for. If I was able to reopen my thing, then you would have seen in the Excel spreadsheet the quartiles of the muscles, and that's part of the analysis that I'll be doing in the statistical analysis when I get around to it. But in terms of the overall body fat, that's probably not within my scope, but it could be somebody else's research scope. I'm more looking at the fat infiltration and the size of the muscle itself.
Brilliant. I'm flicking between screens here to try and get these questions. After all this medical research, what's your educated feel for the long-term sustained presence of Homo sapiens off Earth?
My educated feel is that I think being an interplanetary species is inevitable. I think that we don't know if there's going to be ever a disaster on Earth that will cause us to have to spread to other worlds. But I think especially at the rate that we're going in this century, I think that we will be starting to exist and civilize ourselves on other planets eventually. It's just human nature.
Beautiful. I think you might have answered this in a way before. Is one gender type better for some space exploration jobs than the other? Do you think we could consider any type of so it's gone off the screen. Amputation for living in space? Ooh, that sounds a bit gruesome. Is there one gender better, more suited than the other? I think you might have answered that.
There are different physiological processes that occur at different rates between men and women. I can't quite remember what they are. It's not in the scope of AgRisa as I know it, but for example, women seem to retain their hearing a bit more than men do. And they also tend to be able to keep their muscle mass in space, from what I've read in the literature, compared to men.
Brilliant. So I've got to ask this question. Do you want to go to space, Vienna?
Yes, I do.
Fantastic.
I don't know what sort of responsibilities I should have. I'm thinking of just being a space tourist and just discarding myself of all responsibilities and enjoying the view.
I think you're doing all the right things right now. Well done. We're very impressed.
Vienna, if I might ask one quick question.
Yes.
Do you know whether there was any consideration ever given to creating artificial gravity on the ISS?
Probably not. The only reason being is that it requires quite a lot of infrastructure, which is both expensive and massive. So there's probably other priorities that the ISS is meant to sustain. And so that artificial gravity via centrifuge is quite low on the list. In addition to that, the astronauts do maintain their muscle mass quite well with the 2 hours of exercise that they do every day already. But this is the sort of novel research that's meant to give us insight into what other ways we could use to help rehabilitate astronauts, especially for long duration missions where the Earth isn't so close by.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Vienna, a number of years ago, we had a presentation from a scientist here in Melbourne who, in conjunction with some other engineers, had developed, and I can't remember the exact term, but it was a positive pressure suit. Essentially, it's a suit that you wear in space where it's constantly putting pressure at a very low level, but a constant pressure on the body. And I think they were actually going to fly one of those suits up to the ISS. I think it actually happened. I'm not sure what the results were. I don't know whether you aware of that at all, or?
Yeah, I went to a course called Humans in Space, which is run by the Australasian Aerospace Medicine Society, and James Waldie is a guy who's working on that at the moment. He's working with my supervisor, Dr. Cable, on skin suits, and he actually brought one to the gathering for us to all have a feel of it. It's quite interesting, and yeah, hopefully it goes off the ground and perhaps gets used.
Indeed.
Oh, Rowena in the chat has just said he did fly it to the ISS. So
right.
That answers your question.
Yes, you did right. Yes.
She knows more than me.
And you're better at reading things on multiple screens than I as well. So well done, Vienna. Okay, we're kind of run out of we've gone over the official time for tonight's session, but I'm more than happy to stay here for a while if other people are. And perhaps Malcolm, I can see you're still there, and I think Alice might still be here. So perhaps we might open the floor up to questions of any of the presenters, if you'd like.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yes, Naomi.
Yeah, this centrifuge research has been going for a long time in the bed rest. And from my experience, they were looking at small ones for taking up to space, which there's no space in space for them at the moment. But I was just inquiring from Vienna, I think that I watched that they were doing 4 hours of exercise on the space station every day, and I wanted to know if they've compared results on muscle mass and fat accumulation with the exercise they're doing at the moment, with the centrifuge testing they're doing as well at the moment, or is it more for rehab purposes rather than making a different exercise regime in space?
Yeah, so for the astronauts, it would be both for rehabilitation as they come to the ground, as well as perhaps maintenance of the muscle on a long duration mission. As far as I know, there hasn't been data that's been compared between exercise on the ISS with current methods with the centrifuge generating artificial gravity on Earth. I don't think that has been done yet, just because you have too many confounding factors, and you need healthy patients who have not been to space or have not done the excessive training needed to become an astronaut to do this proof of concept research.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in maybe on this? I think one of the reasons why we've struggled to do artificial gravity so far is that our ability to get payload up from Earth, up the gravity well into orbit, has been really limited based on our rocket technology. You're starting to see new launch capabilities emerging with SpaceX, Starship Super Heavy getting 150 tons of payload into LEO. And you're also seeing I think the potential for space-based manufacturing that can construct large structures in space using space-based resources. So I think we might be approaching a point whereby we can start to think about building large structures in space, such as rotating space stations, the sort of thing that Vienna was talking about with 2001: Space Odyssey, that, you know, classic rotating space station. We haven't been able to think about doing that in the past because our technology simply hasn't been there. It's been too expensive to haul all that up out of Earth's gravity well. If you build it in space using space-based resources, and if you use heavy lift reusable vehicles like Starship or New Glenn or New Armstrong, then suddenly you can do a lot more. And suddenly we can start thinking about, well, can we experiment with a rotating structure in space and see what that can do for artificial gravity? And then we can start to do some real interesting experimentation on the medical front. So I'd be interested to know Vienna's perspective on that.
I totally agree with you, Malcolm, and that's a really good question and point. That sort of harkens back to the point that I made before about why we haven't gotten one on the ISS yet. It's really just resources and how massive that structure would be to bring it up there. So it's got competing priorities, and I think that we would need a lot better rocket technology to be able to bring such a thing into space. ISRU, perhaps when we start doing that, that might be a different story. Say if we start making a deep a lunar gateway and perhaps using the resources from the moon to build or 3D print the centrifuge, something like that. I'm just imagining things, but that could be a possibility.
I think there's another factor here though. So back in the days when the US was still had a Von Braun model and they were contemplating a spinning space station, an architect was commissioned to do a habitability study, and obviously it was on Earth, and that has limitations because of that. But the conclusions of this habitability study was that being in something that was spinning would be really unpleasant and nobody would enjoy it. And there are other reasons why that was abandoned. But I think that would be, has anyone ever been in a gravity rotor in an amusement park?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You like it? Like, I thought it was horrible.
The interesting thing about that is that, and I was in one at the Adelaide Royal Show, where the floor dropped away from your feet.
Yeah.
So it was actually cylindrical. Some of them are like a cone, but this one was cylindrical. And you immediately have the impression that you're looking at the ceiling when you're rotating and you're lying on the floor. That's the impression you get. But the problem with the Von Braun space station concept is a thing called the Coriolis effect. And it's to do with the fluid in the inner ear and the semicircular canals. And this, if you start walking around in that kind of space station, that can produce effects like can cause you to become nauseated. And my recollection is that there has been some work on that in the United States many years ago. But you're quite right, Alice. It is not as straightforward as it would seem.
Yeah, I think Mars Nunn is making a great point. It needs to be really big. You can't have something call it small like the International Space Station. You've got to have something really big. So maybe we're talking more like a space colony rather than a space station.
Yes.
Rotating.
The bigger the radius, the less of the Coriolis effect, a phenomenon that would trouble you, as I recall. Yes.
Oh, Vienna, I've got a question for you.
Yes, Stephen.
What size your centrifuge was, which you did on your patients for your study?
The size of the centrifuge, that's a really good question. I actually don't know. It's the full title of my study involves the word short arm centrifuge. So although the advantage of a short arm centrifuge is that it takes up less space, the disadvantage is that it's got a very, very high gravity gradient. So it may cause those Coriolis effects if the subject turns his head or whatnot, or her head. It is quite short though. It's probably, if I look at the image in my presentation, then it's probably a maximum 2 meters in radius. Quite small.
So you would have had a very high differential between head and feet in that particular situation.
Yep.
And your patients obviously didn't move, so they wouldn't have experienced any Coriolis effects because they were lying down, it appeared. So in that situation, it wouldn't matter if the centrifuge was small. You only have to worry about the gradient in that case. The head to the feet, you have a stronger gravity at the feet or the head, depending whether they were upside down in the centrifuge. Oh no, they would have been.
The head was near,
Yeah.
was at the centre.
Yeah, the head would have been at the centre, of course, yes. Yeah, I like the centrifuge in 2001, the Discovery spacecraft, where then you Jupiter. The diameter of that, if you haven't watched the movie or you haven't looked it up, was around about 11.5 metres, I believe. And that was actually shot in a giant Ferris wheel on the set. And it was, I think, 11.5 metres. The actual entire spaceship has a diameter of 13 metres. And Starship, which is SpaceX's craft, is 9 metres diameter. And I have a theory that, or Elon Musk suggested that they would have a little running track around the diameter of the Starship, much like 2001 Space Odyssey, so that people could run around the ship and generate their own artificial gravity. I thought that was quite an interesting idea, and I think that would be quite successful too.
Yeah, definitely interesting. We've got an answer from my supervisor himself. Dr. Cable has said that the centrifuge is 3.8 metres in fact. So there's your answer, Stephen.
In fact, on Skylab, some of the astronauts ran around the inside of Skylab using the series of wall containers, which made a circular track. And I'm kind of intrigued by that, because the faster you run, the greater would be the G-force that you would develop. And I've wondered whether, in fact, that could be done. In a small spacecraft, of course, you would have a force that would be moving around the spacecraft. And in fact, in the ISS, they have to be careful with them exercising, because that can destabilize the ISS.
No!
Of course they have
Wow.
Yeah, it's isolated from the rest of the vehicle. Yeah.
I know something about the Skylab track, in case you weren't aware. The Skylab track had a diameter of around about 6 metres. The actual upper stage booster they used to build Skylab, I think, was 6.6 metres. The Skylab track diameter was 6 metres. So that was what you would consider very similar to your centrifuge, Vienna, because it would be considered a short arm centrifuge with a fairly short or large differential between the head and the feet. On Starship, I did some calculations, and with the diameter of about 8.5 metres, if you ran it around about 30 kilometres an hour, which is quite feasible for an averagely fit person, you'll generate Earth-like gravity at that speed. So if you just run really fast in a Starship-sized vehicle, you can actually get Earth gravity. So I think the sense of that is that you could easily generate Earth-like conditions just by running.
It's a lot simpler than trying to lug up a centrifuge, isn't it? Or get the entire spacecraft to do spins.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right. You don't have wouldn't have the payload penalty.
And you could carry a weight with you to add extra load on your body as well, you know?
Yes, good point.
Yeah, the other option is to put on a set of roller skates or a small bicycle or something like that and ride around. If you've ever been to a circus, I believe there's a stunt people do, and I can't quite remember it, but they get on a motorbike and they ride around the inside of what looks like a large water tank. The diameter of the tanks they use is only about 7 or 8 metres, and they generate well over 2 Gs doing that. If they go fast enough, they basically can ride on the wall of this water tank and ride right up to the top of the tank, and they stay on the wall because their artificial gravity doing that is so strong that they get sufficient grip to actually ride the vertical walls up and down on their motorbikes. I can't remember the name of the.
Yes, well,
Wall of Death.
there was a side show at the Royal Adelaide Show, and I'm sure that went around Australia. It was called the Globe of Death, and it was a steel sphere, which was of woven flat sheet metal, strips of flat sheet metal. And they had, that was an amazing thing, because they had one rider going from top to bottom around that circumference. At the same time, they had another rider going around the ordinary circumference, and they had to miss each other. And it was quite remarkable. I presume now it's considered too dangerous, but it was a great draw card for many years at the show.
Oh, I've never seen that one. That sounds awesome.
Aptly called the Globe of Death.
Indeed.
That's really interesting, Brett.
We're still getting lots and lots of questions coming in through other channels, and I can't possibly get to all of them. I do have one from Malcolm. What is the implication of Australia getting its space situational awareness system? Also, is Australia ready for an early warning system from space?
Okay, well, the Space Situational Awareness establishment out at Exmouth in Western Australia is really important. Our location, our geographical location in the Southern Hemisphere, is perfect for watching launches out of China in terms of their space launch activities and looking up into GEO from Exmouth. So the Space Surveillance Telescope and the space radar system that they're placing there, really plays an important role, or will play an important role once it's operational in 2021 within the US Space Surveillance Network in terms of watching Chinese activities in space and from China. And the second question was, sorry.
A space early warning system.
Space early warning system.
An early warning system from space. So I assume it's.
All right. Okay. So missile attack early warning.
Yeah.
There used to be, I think there still is to a degree, an old constellation called DSP, Defense Support Program 647, which in the 60s and the 70s was a missile early warning satellites that would monitor ICBM silos in Moscow, in the Soviet Union, and would detect missiles firing out of those silos. That's been replaced by SBIRS, a space-based inference system, which is obviously more advanced. And the key advantage of those satellites is it gives essentially much greater early warning of an attack. So whereas if we use ground-based radar like BMU's, Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, we might get 15 minutes warning. With space-based satellites, we get the full 30 minutes or close to the full 30 minutes. So it gives national command authorities the ability to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to write out the attack? Are they going to launch on warning? Or are they going to launch under attack? And most importantly, it gives the chance for evacuating the national command leadership to safe sites and the airborne early warning, the airborne command post. So those satellites are really critical in terms of deterrence, because it makes it more difficult for an adversary to launch a surprise attack, not just from Russia or China, but from submarines at sea, because those satellites can see those missiles as soon as they fly. And Australia plays a critical role in that in terms of the joint facility at Pine Gap, because that's a critical downlink for the SBIRS and the DSP to provide early warning to the US in the event of a nuclear attack.
I'll just ask a question if you wouldn't mind, Malcolm. I've got two actually. You talked about, what do you see as space mining as being a role for Australia? I mean, there was a big discussion and excitement about it a few years ago, but we haven't heard much of that in more recent times. Do you see that as part of our?
Well, look, I think the focus at the moment is on mining the moon. That we're wanting to find out just how much water is in the lunar regolith. So they're going to send a rover up there called Viper, which is designed to move around the lunar surface and hunt for water inside the lunar regolith. If we can mine that, then we can use that water to produce rocket fuel. We can produce oxygen from it for a lunar base, to sustain a lunar base, and all sorts of products from that water itself. And then, of course, there's other potential rare earth materials. If we somehow crack the commercial nuclear fusion, then helium-3 on the lunar surface is going to be critical to make to make nuclear fusion work. And finally, we get to the whole issue of resource-rich asteroids. How do we mine those? People talk about, resource-rich asteroids as being worth $9 trillion in terms of rare earths and so forth. But if you mine it and then you bring all that back to Earth, you crash the value of the market. So it's actually better to use that resource in space to sustain and enable more space activity than it is to try and bring it back on Earth and become a 20 quadrillionaire, multi-mega millionaire sort of thing. So I would argue that asteroid mining is really important in terms of enabling and funding space-based economies and space-based industry, rather than trying to bring that wealth back to Earth.
Thanks, Michael. I've got a really important question I'd like to ask you and get your comments on. I've been asked by somebody I know here in Australia in the space industry, and I'm not sure how much involvement you've got with the agency, but and Al's touched on it before. There's a bit of frustration in the model that the Australian Space Agency are using in the granting of assistance and permits in the cost plus model that they've got. So, for example, if someone wants to apply for a launch, they have to get it verified and qualified by the agency. The agency then goes to a third party and pays them whatever thousands of dollars to do that study, which gets charged back to the original person that wants to do the launch. And as else mentioned, it makes it actually unsustainable for them to actually go ahead and do it. Do you have any insights into that problem and how that might get around that?
I don't have any insights into how the agency does that, but from what you're describing, it sounds like a great way to snuff out Australia's space launch industry and smother the potential development of satellite manufacturing in this country. And I think that there needs to be far less of the dead hand of regulation on this. There needs to be a much more streamlined process that is quick and that is, conducive to supporting the growth of space industry. And this is why the Space Agency was set up. It was set up to grow that space industry sector. And if they're creating needless regulation and needless bureaucracy, that's going to work against that goal, and ultimately they could fail. So they need, as I said, I don't have insight into the actual processes, but if that's how it's emerging, then that's a bad move.
I don't know how everyone's feeling. It's 10 o'clock here in Melbourne, in Victoria. I'm happy to keep going if everyone else is happy to keep going. More questions? I do want to run a test though, either now or later on. We've got an inbuilt poll system in Zoom, and we want to try and test it for our purposes. If anyone's interested, it'll just pop up on your screen. If you want to just click on that, and it's just a way of making use of the technology. If you want to read those questions and
next human
landing of what?
I beg your pardon. I just did it quickly. On the moon. Sorry. On my front door.
Can we see the results afterwards?
Yes. Actually, we'll go. You can share on the screen here, can't we? What we're trying to use it for is for potentially anonymous voting if we have to use that for our AGM, annual general meeting. But we can just as easily use it for what do people want to see in our next meeting? What did you think of the speakers? Or I don't know about that. Yeah, we can use all sorts of things, but okay. So once you close the poll, everyone will see the results, of my understanding. So Ashley's in the back end driving that, so he'll probably wait until everyone's voted, or maybe an arbitrary amount of time, and we'll pop it up.
Another one or two people, and we'll hit 90%, and then.
Oh well, we'll just
Malcolm.
Just throw it up, Ash.
Yep, done.
An interesting question about funding for exploration. We've seen in Australia over the last century, aircraft manufacturing industries come and go. Satellites, a WRE being built, and that's all sort of folded up. even motor cars here and then gone. And yet, America seems to have had a similar sort of change of political sides of the argument, but they've kept NASA going all the way through from the 60s. Any thoughts on that at all?
Look, I think the space technology is critical to human future. Everyone understands that. There's always going to be a requirement for satellites. There's going to be a requirement for launch vehicles. If we're going down the path of mega constellations, then ultimately Space 3.0, then that requirement is going to grow. So I see that Australia has a sustainable base for manufacturing of space technologies. If you want to compare space industry to the motor industry, I don't think the motor industry was ever sustainable for the long term. Whereas I do think space is the future. It's space, short of some sort of global catastrophe, or we lose our minds and shrink back into backwardness. We're going to have our civilization being based on space technology, both here on Earth and out there. And so Australia, I think, is on the right track in terms of supporting that. And it should expand. There's no reason why we can't go from sort of launch vehicles that Gilmore Space Technology are considering, for example, to something more sophisticated that is fully reusable, or we do agreements with US commercial companies for them to operate from Australia. So imagine the potential for Starship Super Heavy to launch out of Florida and then land in Nhulunbuy in Northern Territory, and then launch out of Nhulunbuy when they need to. So I think there's all sorts of possibilities here that will make it sustainable. I don't believe it will be like the motor vehicle industry. And we could have sustained an aviation manufacturing sector here if we wanted to, but the problem is the technology at the time was all about manned aircraft. If you look at the future, it's all about unmanned systems. We have the potential to develop that area again if we want to. Look at what Boeing is doing with the Loyal Wingman air power combat teaming system. That's something that would potentially open up Australia's aviation sector again. So,
where did the Jindavik come from? Australia.
Well, it was Jindavik, but it wasn't sustained by government. Whereas if you give it to the commercial sector and allow them to innovate, it's sustainable. It's only when you require everything, the government to do everything, that everything falls apart.
Thanks for a very, very interesting evening.
Okay. Fantastic. So listen, it is a school night. So what say we wrap this up at 10:15 Melbourne time, about another 8 minutes. How about that?
Yep.
Anyone else got anything to ask, comment, suggest? Oh, maybe we'll just wrap it up now then. Oh, okay.
Vienna.
Yes.
Yeah, because I was at Ames Research Centre in '97 and they were doing the bed rest experiments. Have you looked at their data, or do you collaborate with them at all in the research, or are you just collaborating with Europe?
Just with Europe at the moment. NASA provided funding and research support. The team that I'm with is UK and ESA based though, so sorry, I wouldn't know anything about Ames.
Oh yeah. I don't know what's going on there at the moment, whether they're continuing it on or not. Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
A lot of hard work doing all your image processing, whatever you do.
That's the nature of research.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I have a question. Vienna, Len Halpern here. I think you misunderstood the thrust of my question about the future of Homo sapiens in space. I agree with you philosophically. No, I agree with you 100% that we need to go into space if we're going to survive. There are too many things that can go wrong here, and the Earth on its own is a single point of failure. Agreed. What I'm saying is that Homo sapiens is just where we are now, but all the medical evidence seems to suggest that this biological package is not built for space. We're evolved in 1G, and as we move off-world, we're going to evolve into something else. What I'm saying is, do you think Homo sapiens will inhabit space for prolonged periods in the long term? And my personal view is I don't think that's possible.
That's a really good question. I don't think there's ever been a point in history where organisms have had to adapt to such a stark difference in environment between Earth and space. Interestingly though, we do see it in bacteria, and I know that bacteria are very different from humans, but bacteria start to adapt their DNA straight away after being put into microgravity. And if only we had that sort of ability, right, to completely adapt and to continue to multiply and destroy the organisms around us, that would be really great, but we're humans, so we can't adapt as quickly. If we were to adapt to a spaceflight environment, eventually, then I think if we start with what I'm studying, the gluteal muscles and the hip muscles and the muscles that keep us upright, what defines us as Homo sapiens is our ability to run long distances and our large hip muscles and thigh muscles compared to the rest of our body and compared to other animals. So I think if we were to say settle on Mars or the moon, or even stay on the ISS for a long time, God forbid, then we would eventually perhaps adapt to develop smaller muscles in the gluteal area and the quads, because we wouldn't need to be using those to stand upright as much. I think, okay, if we talk about GZ would be the force from the head to the toe, on the toes of the head. And so the centrifuge acts on the GZ axis, but we wouldn't be needing to work against the GZ axis on a planet like Mars as much, because it's got 38% of the gravity here on Earth. And so perhaps if we did work, if we use less GZ muscles and perhaps more GX or GY muscles going forward or going to the side, then we might develop perhaps a larger upper body, or larger muscles in the body compared to our weight-bearing muscles. So that's probably one adaptation that I can see happening. Perhaps another one that's less easy to notice is that we'll be breathing a different mixture of air. I don't know how well we're going to be able to simulate normal Earth air mixture. And so the air mixture that we generate for our habitats might be a little bit different. And so our physiology in terms of our blood and our respiratory system might need to adapt to be able to make the best use of the new air mixture that we have. Does that make sense?
What I'm hearing sounds like evolution.
Yeah,
so what you're describing doesn't sound like today's humans. So when you talk about oxygen, we're adapted to 21% partial pressure. I know that if you go over 30% partial pressure, it's toxic, and you can't go too far below 21%, because then we just don't get enough oxygen. So there's that critical range of viable oxygen for humans to breathe. So if we're going to evolve into a 30% or 40% oxygen breathing species, or a 10% oxygen breathing species, then again, I'm just saying that's not Homo sapiens. Might be Homo astronautica or something, but we're not there yet. And we may just be a transient stage. As you know, evolution never stands still. And there are natural selection pressures, but now you're talking about artificial selection pressures, because we're choosing to go into space. So it's just interesting to see what we're going to evolve into. And I don't think Homo sapiens, these meat bags that we live in at present, can't survive in space.
Not without very, very intense life support, no. And in terms of when you're talking about the species Homo sapiens, a species is defined as the members of a group which can interbreed with each other. So perhaps if a person who was born on Mars is able to reproduce with somebody who was born on Earth and has spent their whole life on Earth, that Mars person would still be considered a Homo sapien by that definition, that they can reproduce.
But
so as long as they can actually produce.
But Australopithecus could breed with each other. They were species. How are they different from us? What differentiates us is our frontal lobe size. That's what made Homo sapiens, because we are sapient beings. We're not sentient beings, we're sapient beings. So that's where the difference comes in. That we have the largest frontal lobe of any of the animals on Earth.
I've got a question.
I would suggest that if people live on Mars for a sufficiently long time, they would adapt. A student asked me once, not so long ago, what would happen to the fetus growing if a woman carried a fetus to term in a weightless state. What would be the effect on the fetus? And similarly, if a woman carried a a pregnancy on Mars to term, what would be the outcome? These are interesting and challenging questions, and time will tell, won't it?
Yep.
I mean, a fetus in a woman's body on Earth is almost in a weightless environment anyway, to be honest.
Right.
Okay, we've just got
Water.
If we're going to, sorry.
Oh, it's in water. But they might have looked at plants growing. Have they looked at plants growing?
Don't know. I've just got one last question, which follows on a bit from what you were just saying, so it sort of fits in nicely, from Rowena Christensen. Will humans born on Mars and who are adapted to a different gravitational environment still be the same species or evolved into a different species, subspecies, or of humans? Interesting questions. It also applies to the reproduction in space.
Childbirth
That meant to be a question for me.
Oh, for you, but anyone else who wants to have a stab, I don't know.
I know the answer to that one.
You know the answer, okay.
That's fine. I'll jump in. Look, I think it's a really interesting debate as to how humanity evolves in space in terms of a biological species. I think ultimately we will evolve as we move deeper into space. I talked in my presentation, we shouldn't get stuck at Mars. We should keep going out. So, you know, how do we evolve if we live on, you know, some of the larger asteroids? I'm sure some of you here have watched the series The Expanse, where you have humans living on Ceres, and as a result of the lack of gravity, they can't go back to Earth. So then they become permanent spacefaring species, where they live on Ceres or they live on Titan or what have you. To me, this is a fascinating idea because it forces us to become a spacefaring species. And we have to adapt. And that might be a process of natural evolution. It might be a process of artificial change that we decide. That latter approach is fraught with peril because it's akin to genetic engineering here on Earth. And we all know the potential risks associated with that. But we're going to have to do it. And I think also part of the solution is technology. The ability to develop artificial gravity, the ability to get places a lot faster than what we have been, the ability to provide breathable environments and grow food using in situ resources. These are all issues that we'll get on top of in the coming decades. But obviously it's good that we're having a discussion now, because it means we're thinking about where we might be 100, 200 years from now. And that's before we even think about the potential offered by interstellar travel if we ever crack that one day, you know, and we go to radically different planets. I mean, how do we evolve, for example, on a mega Earth where it might be 1.5 times the mass of our planet if we're heavier? You know, that's an interesting sort of scenario to think about.
Fantastic. All right, look, it's getting very late, so it's probably a great time to finish off. We've got a lot of things to discuss and decide, and that's great. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Malcolm, for joining us tonight. It's been a real honour and pleasure. And Alice, I think she's left us by now. She's past her bedtime, but that was fantastic. And of course, Vienna, that was absolutely wonderful, Vienna. We really enjoyed having you on board and really got the discussion going well. And we invite both of you back at any time in the future. Our next public meeting here in Melbourne, hopefully, physically will be on the 27th of July, but we will also be streaming possibly via Zoom or YouTube or something along those lines. So please do join us if you're able to on that date. And with that, I'm going to, I just got a message. Yeah, okay. I'm just going to wrap that up and say thank you again. Thank you, Ashley, who's writing all the technology, and Andrew, Michael, for getting all the schedule together tonight. It's been a wonderful evening, and thank you so much. Have a great night. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon. And once again, this will be on our YouTube channel. So if you go to our website, space.asn.au, follow the link to the YouTube icon, you'll see this recording there probably in a couple of days. And there's all of our other meetings there as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Thanks, speakers, and thanks everyone else that joined in. I really appreciate having you.
Malcolm, night, Vienna.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Michael, want to stop recording?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ash.